Hello, this is Greg Scorzo, and welcome to the Coda Publishing Podcast number 11. Today we'll be talking to the philosopher Piers Benn about his recent book, Intellectual Freedom and the Culture Wars. In this part one of a two-part podcast, we'll be discussing issues that arise in his book, such as freedom of speech, the tension between activism and free inquiry, whether enlightenment freedoms are a way for the powerful to subjugate the powerless, whether free speech is right-wing, the definition of transphobia, the censoring of Germaine Greer, racism and Halloween costumes, the psychology of Donald Trump, whether the mainstream media is left-wing, and the problem of ideological fanaticism. So I'm here talking to the fabulous Piers Benn, who, for my audience who might not know, is, I believe, the nephew of the great Tony Benn. Is that correct?
Well, I am, or I suppose was. Yes.
That must be a really interesting kind of familial background from which to then go into philosophy, which is what you did.
Yes, I don't see any particular connection between the two things. It's just a contingent fact about me that when I was growing up, I had an uncle, my father's brother, who was very famous and very much excoriated in many quarters in the media. And I did, discuss philosophical issues with him sometimes. But I think, that's just, I went into philosophy because that's what those questions, what gripped me when I was a teenager. And various personal concerns about, the mind and religion and knowledge and things like that. So, yes, I mean, I don't think he was particularly philosophical. He was very pragmatic. But I was just fascinated by, as many people are, by questions of those kinds at that age. So, yeah.
That's similar. We have a similar teenage trajectory then. So was it philosophy of religion and epistemology and philosophy of mind that primarily brought you to philosophy?
It's interesting. I'm trying to think back because it's quite a long time ago. We had an English teacher at school who'd done a philosophy as part of his degree at Cambridge, English literature, and a philosophy minor. And he introduced me to philosophy in possibly a rather skewed way because the kind of people I was reading, aged about 18, 19, were people like A.J. Ayer, who nobody talks about nowadays. But I always rather liked his clarity and fluency and the way he had an excellent ability to get at the heart of a question and to follow questions Socratically. I know nobody talks much about Ayer now and his whole logical positivism, but nobody talks about that. And even he rejected that in its fundamentalist versions. But I remember when I was 21, I was very honoured and extremely intimidated to go around to his flat and interview him. For ISIS magazine at Oxford, I was he probably thought I was a horrible little pipsqueak, and I went along with a tape recorder. And he made things difficult to begin with because he tried to fob me off and told me I should buy his book instead, his autobiography.
Oh my!
And when I phoned back and said, "Well, I can buy the autobiography, but I'd rather meet you," really, he sort of relented and gave me an hour and 10 minutes of his time. And I wish I still had the tape. I lent it to somebody and I never got it back, or lost it to some other way, which is a great shame because it could be quite interesting now.
Yeah, my original mentor in philosophy, Robert Greg Cavan, was a huge A.J. Ayer fan.
Yes.
And he was still, as late as the late 90s, he might even be still now, a logical positivist about ethics.
Goodness me, the one and only one. Have him stuffed. I can't imagine anyone else's.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I like, and that was what I was reading at the time. Much later, though, when I was a graduate student, I was pleased to be supervised by Roger Scruton, who was a very different political character to my uncle. In fact, they did meet on a couple of occasions, and I think a message about how my supervision was overdue and I need to produce some work was passed by the one from the other.
Oh, my God.
But yeah, so you could say there are, I don't see myself as having any particular mentor, but I think that was certainly an influence on my thinking. It brought certain questions to mind that otherwise might not have come to mind.
So what was it like working with Mr. Scruton? Because he's a hero of mine. I'm curious.
Professor Scruton.
Yes.
Well, it was interesting because I was a graduate student at Birkbeck in the 80s and early 90s. And he was, a rising star then. He was getting into trouble even then for some of his views on cultural and social issues. Although Birkbeck was very supportive of him, even though most of his colleagues didn't agree with him. And I'd never agreed all that much with all he said. I mean, certain things I resonate, and I think he had a way of getting some very important insights and questions. But I've never considered myself to be a conservative, and I've never quite understood what the term is anyway. But it was certainly, he had eccentric ways, like tutorials that lasted 2 minutes while he puffed at a huge Havana cigar, and you felt you had to earn your time. But he was doing lots of things in Eastern Europe at that time. A lot of quite dangerous things, especially in Czechoslovakia, setting up a secret university. And he sent me to Poland, actually, for a few weeks to do some teaching. But I never did anything dangerous. But there were networks of people taking certain risks, actually, to get speakers over, including lefties like Jacques Derrida, if he was a lefty. I mean, all kinds of people. It wasn't a conservative outfit as such. Getting them to attend this secret university based in Brno, I think, in what was Czechoslovakia. Shame Czechoslovakia no longer exists because it's a rather romantic name for a country. So that was all interesting and quite exciting at the time.
So were you very kind of specifically interested and trained in the analytic tradition, or did you in any way have any interest in sort of the continental thinkers as well at that time?
Well, I don't really see myself as fitting into a box, and I think there are enormous gaps in my knowledge of philosophy, I have to admit. There are lots of gaps in my reading, which may well come true in the book we're going to discuss. I suppose that my way of thinking was, broadly, I'd call it Socratic. I like getting questions clear, and I like following through to answers, taking into account counter-arguments and counter-examples in the way that people like Eyre did, and many others too. I think what I'm increasingly seeing, though, is that what Roger Scruton was doing was starting, and I'm not the person to have this thought, I didn't invent this idea, but he started with some questions that were common in continental philosophy, but approached them in an analytical style, which is a combination much needed because, he wrote a very interesting book on sexual desire, much criticized at the time for certain views he had, but very insightful, I think, although I didn't agree with all of it. But these are the things, like Sartre writing on those things, but he managed to put it in analytic idiom and to clarify concepts and arguments. And I think that it's a gap in my knowledge, actually. I would like to get to know more about continental philosophy through an analytic kind of Socratic lens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you became a philosopher after having been trained by all these amazing people, amazing in their own way, let's say. And in the period between then and now, were you doing a lot of work about political and cultural issues, or is this book kind of a new step in the direction that your career is going in?
Well, yes, I wasn't really. I suppose I could never quite define what my focus of interests were. They tend to be quite. I was teaching when I did various jobs. I had a 4-year job at St Andrews in the early 90s, and then that led to a job that turned out to be 6 years at Leeds. And I was doing quite a lot of applied ethics at that time, or whatever the correct term is. And I got more into applied philosophy, applied ethics, and I was on the committee for the Society for Applied Philosophy. I was also interested and continue to be interested in philosophy of religion, although I haven't published much in that area. Mm-hmm. I've been teaching that recently, so I want to beef up some publications. And so, yes, and I wrote an introduction to ethics in the late 90s that I think even still sells, although I couldn't write it now because I haven't really kept up with cutting-edge moral theory. There's just too much of it.
Right.
And it's too abstract. But yes, it was ethics, philosophy of religion, aspects of political philosophy that shade into applied ethics. So there's stuff that interests me on the questions of freedom and toleration, free speech, identity politics, the things I was never into very much earlier on in my career. But I was always interested, there's always a background thing going on in my mind, how to make sense of some of these issues. And so when I got the opportunity to write my book, I felt I could crystallize these thoughts a bit better, though no doubt there are plenty of gaps in my knowledge and understanding.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that part of what pushed you into writing Intellectual Freedom and the Culture Wars, the book we're going to discuss today, is that after about 2014, suddenly pop culture, university life, Hollywood, the BBC, suddenly became hyper-politicized in a way that it never had before?
Yes. Well, the story of how I wrote the book is I was sort of surfing the web sometime in 2016 or 17 or thereabouts, and I came across what looked like a new, interesting, subversive magazine, which is now very well known, called Quillette, although it wasn't so well known then. And I saw that, I looked at some of the stuff, and then I think a few months later or a bit later, I looked at it again and thought, yes, this looks up my street. I've got a lot of thoughts germinating in my mind about intellectual honesty, free inquiry, free speech, relativism, all the sort of things that people might write about. And I thought, yeah, I think I sent him an article. So I thought a long time about it, and an article for months germinated in my mind. And I finally sent them an article called, I think it's called Freedom of Speech and a Flight from Reason, which to my surprise was published. And on the back of that, somebody I'd met many years ago in another context said, well, why didn't you, I'm a consultant for a publisher, why didn't you work this up into a book? And I sat on it for a long time and thought about it. I sat on it for an unconscionably long time, then finally got a proposal together, and then wrote the book between basically the summer of 2019 and the summer of 2020. And it was interesting because it allowed me to get a lot of thoughts together that I'd been floating in my mind, because since the early 2000s, I was also involved with what was the Institute of Ideas, now the Academy of Ideas,
right.
Run by Clay Fox. And I was contributing in the early noughties to many panels on various things. Then I became detached from them a bit, and then I started getting involved again. And they were interested in these. One of their central missions is free speech. And I thought, yes, they're doing something important. I didn't always agree with the takes they had. I thought some of it was a little bit, I still think some of it's a little bit oversimplified, but they're on the right lines. And that's why I continue to be on their committee. And so I thought, well, let's try to see what's right and what's wrong about this kind of approach. And that's what I tried to do in writing the book. Mm-hmm. In the spirit of quite a lot of agnosticism on some of the subjects, and some lack of confidence, actually, because some very clever people in philosophy will not like some of the things I say, and it's difficult to know how to reply when that happens.
Mm-hmm. So alongside all of this happening and the book being written, free speech has become a huge cultural battleground issue.
Yeah.
In a way that it wasn't at any time that I remember in my lifetime. And I'm curious what you think about this, but for me, it seems like the reason why it has become what it has become is there is a generation of activists who are very much enabled by mainstream media, supported by mainstream media, who don't take the view of free speech that you do in this book. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah. I think that's true. And these activists are found on different ends of the political spectrum. It's not just a left-wing thing, whatever left-wing means, but it certainly is a left-wing thing. Or as I say towards the end of the book, it's not all the left by any means, because there are plenty of people I know who are clearly on the economic left and to some extent on the social left, but who do believe in old-fashioned Enlightenment values. Mm-hmm. And so there are plenty of those people. I think they're rather too silent in the academy at the moment, or I suspect they're too silent. But they certainly exist. But yes, you're right. There is a sort of, when we talk about cultural warriors of the left, the people who have, and they're a minority of people, I think, but very vocal people, who have been since maybe about 2013, that sort of time, have been organizing disinvitations of various controversial speakers, proscribing views, saying that certain views about certain issues may not be uttered, that certain research projects shouldn't take place. I mean, these things are given a lot of publicity by the centrist or right-wing press, and it's important not to get it out of proportion. But it has been going on, and I think it's something which is depressing, and which it's been provoking quite a solid response. There's been a lot of criticism of it, but yes, it has been happening, and I wanted to oppose it in a fair and rational way.
So to start off with, what would you say is for our listeners the basic concept of freedom of speech that you want to advocate in this book, that all the other chapters are sort of in various ways grappling with and expressing?
Yeah, I should say the book is not mostly about freedom of speech. I mean, there's one chapter which deals with those issues, but there's a thread of loosely related issues. I mean, there's a chapter on, I think I called it Taking Offence, but it's really about focuses on two campus controversies in particular that took place in 2015, and there have been plenty since. I mean, in the first chapter, I tried to put the case for what I called rather loosely intellectual freedom, which I suppose encompasses freedom of inquiry, a sort of liberality of discourse that I want to promote, whereby people are not afraid to go to certain places in their thinking. I invoke George Orwell's satirical concept of crime stop in that first chapter. This is if you remember in 1984, there's the book within the book written by this fictitious figure called Emmanuel Goldstein, who's the arch enemy, who's written this very truthful book, actually, about how the party member is trained. And you are trained to stop certain thoughts at the threshold of heresy. So you know what the thought is, but you must stop yourself at that point. So you both know and do not know what the thought is. And I thought, yes, this is very insightful. This describes a state of mind I've been in sometimes, and I've been a certain thoughts have come to mind, but I know that most people around me will think it's rubbish or think it's bad, it's evidence of bad character, so there must be something wrong with it, I better stop. And I thought, well, no, we don't want academic life or indeed any life to be like that. We want to be able to follow through our thoughts where they go, and if they're rubbish, then let them be refuted by good reasons. So I was interested in intellectual freedom, and I think that's inseparable in a way from freedom to speak, although there are restrictions, there should be restrictions on free speech for reasons we might go on to, but there should be a presumption in favour of uttering the views about various things that come to you through freewheeling and open-minded thought. Because unless there's free inquiry, free speech has nothing to work on, because you have no material to read. I mean, you're like the Soviet citizen who had to read only about scientific communism. But unless there's free speech, there can't really be proper free inquiry either, because free inquiry has to take into account what other people have said. So the two things are interlinked. So intellectual freedom, that I broadly called it, is the thread. And then I get on to chapters about, objective reality and all those debates about that, which touches on one or two sensitive issues, on to questions about what I call the epistemological issues behind identity politics. I have a section on something I call the epistemological genetic fallacy, whereby a view is dismissed because it's associated with a certain hegemonic group, for example, a group that's been an oppressor, and on to questions about whether you can be friends with people who you disagree with ideologically. And so I think, I wouldn't say there's one single thread of argument, but there's a loose connection in intellectual freedom, I think, in the book.
Yes, that's very interesting. So it seems in a way like intellectual freedom is really the core of what you're trying to promote. And free speech is almost like a tool that intellectual freedom winds up having to express itself properly.
Yes. I mean, I think that's the connection I saw when writing it, because you can't separate these two things entirely. If I want the right to utter my views, I want my views to be well-grounded, insofar as any views can be well-grounded, and well-researched. Now, I can't do the research properly if other people aren't allowed to inquire into certain controversial areas, if they can't inquire and can't publish their research. Equally, I can't inquire properly if I can't read or think about what people have said freely. So what we need is an openness to truth, and I do believe in truth, complex philosophical concept, obviously, but I do believe in that. I think that it's worth getting there. But I should add, though, that, many people who defend free speech adopt a very standard John Stuart Mill line that says, well, free speech is important because it's the best way to reach truth. And while I agree, I do say something about that in chapter 1, I agree that there's a non-accidental connection between free inquiry, free speech, and the truth that results from it. That can't be the only value of free speech, because that would make free speech entirely instrumentally good. We don't want to say free speech is just instrumentally good for reaching truth, because there could well be, and indeed probably are, other methods of reaching truth. So if you're an indoctrinator who happens to have the truth about some issue and judges, well, it's better that school children don't learn the other side of this because they might be misled, you might, by indoctrinating school children, be very effective in producing true beliefs in them, if your own beliefs happen to be true. So we need to say, either we should just admit that the only value of free speech is instrumental, and sometimes it doesn't have that value because it doesn't help with truth, or we should say that free speech, the value of free speech comes from a wider value. Now, I think one can say that the wider value is freedom in general. Free speech is a kind of offshoot of freedom in general. And of course, that's an important political issue. We all accept our freedom should be circumscribed for the sake of the common good, and maybe in some cases for the sake of ourselves. So, I try to touch on those issues. I don't claim to have a solution, because it's the more I wrote the book, the more massively complicated I realized the issues were. and and how much very sophisticated philosophical literature there was on these questions, and how I was never going to read hundreds of it, and actually made me quite scared when writing the book, because I thought it's going to be ill-informed and half-baked and sort of simplistic. But I was aware of these wider questions. I just touched on them.
Well, it certainly doesn't seem simplistic or half-baked to me. I thought it was one of the most nuanced and detailed books I've read about these issues in terms of laying out all the positions.
It didn't seem, when I was writing it, I didn't have that confidence, but I'm glad you think so. Thank you very much.
No, it's all right. But one thing that it did make me think, and I don't know if you've thought about this as well after writing it, but it seems to me like I'm very moved by your conception of free inquiry, intellectual freedom. Yeah. In the sense that I would like social change to happen because of this free inquiry. I would like social change to happen because people have civilized debates about issues that are controversial, and one side wins, and then the other people can see that the other side has won and they follow suit. I would love that. But my worry is, and this is something activists who don't agree with you often say, that the activist tradition, which is responsible for us holding so many of the good views that we hold, and for not considering so many of the awful questions we could consider, is that social change does not really get propelled by something like free inquiry. It gets propelled by a group of people shout, scream, and throw a tantrum. Everybody else feels somewhat intimidated and shuts up. And then their children grow up in a world where they never knew what it was like to hold the previous views of their parents.
Yes. Well, I think there's something to that. I used to ask the question, would the Russian Revolution have happened if Lenin had been nice? The answer is obviously no. Would feminism have happened in the 70s if women had been nice? Well, probably not. And of course, back then, there's a lot of criticism of alleged extremism and unreasonable ideas. But yes, if social change does actually come about by activism, and the activist mindset and the intellectual mindset, well, they coalesce up to a point, and activists get hold of a certain type of theory, but then the theory ossifies in their minds, and they become incapable of seeing any counter arguments, and they become very dismissive and angry at counter arguments. But they're often very clever people. They're often very intellectual people. So yes, you're right. But I think that if you look at the disasters that certain sorts of activism have produced in the past, if you consider how, if they'd only considered this point or that point at an earlier stage, it might have been avoided, then I think in the end, you can't get away from the need for Socratic and rigorous inquiry. But you're right to point to a tension between the activist impatience with argument and the desire to do things, and the skeptic who says, well, yes, this program might be good in some ways, but have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? Have you thought of this? What disasters like to come with it? Temperamentally, I'm more of a sort of, I suppose, a skeptic, but other people I've known well are temperamentally much more activist and are very impatient with philosophical reasoning.
When you defend free inquiry, do you think on some level you're suggesting that because things are already so good, at least in the West, a better model for social change is the free inquiry-based practices, rather than the activists of the 19th and 20th century that, while they have produced some good things for society, if you keep going along that line, you get a repressive climate of intolerance. If there's too much activism in an area, or in an era, for instance, where it's better for us to be more reflective because we're dealing with quite complex issues this time around, and things just aren't that awful. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm not sure what, I'd need to know in more detail what sort of activism you're talking about. I mean, clearly there have been social changes and attitudinal changes over the last 50 years or so, particularly to do with things like race and feminism and so on, that have been made possible by anger and intolerance, a certain level of intolerance. But I think that in the end, if those changes are to last and not meet with furious counterattacks, they have to be open at least to rational justification. There has to be somebody in those movements who says, look, this is why we thought this, and we consider these counter-arguments, and we consider these possible consequences, and on the evidence available at the time, we thought that our program was still the right one to follow. If that doesn't happen, then when, as is almost certain, flaws begin to emerge or bad consequences begin to emerge that hadn't been foreseen, you get people on the other end of the spectrum saying, aha, we told you so. This program was always wrong. This should never have started. And they ossify in their own ways. They have their own dogmas, which are similarly impermeable to reason. And you just get the old conflicts resurfacing and a lot of acrimony. So I think that, if you want to be a feminist or an anti-racist or whatever it is you want to be, you have at least, if you're to be intellectually honest, you have to believe that there is, or there can be, a sound justification for those positions. And the best way in general, though not always, to reach those sound justifications is through free intellectual inquiry. Now, I admitted the caveat I mentioned a moment ago, which is that sometimes indoctrination might be more effective in creating true beliefs than free inquiry. That's always going to be a problem in the side. But I think that you also want to cultivate a social atmosphere of intellectual freedom, even after your revolution or your social changes have come about. The human mind has a great thirst for, I think, freedom of thought, freedom of action, liberty, being able to determine your own destiny. Think how many of those activist movements we talked about were really at root about promoting the autonomy of a hitherto oppressed group. What's feminism about? Very largely, it's about enhancing the autonomy of women and freeing them from the lack of autonomy imposed by unjust patriarchal structures. Now, what can that autonomy be in the end if it doesn't include an ability to participate in a social atmosphere of liberality and freedom in the way that other groups have been able to participate? So I think in the end, you can't escape the need for a social atmosphere of toleration and, freedom of thought and freedom of action.
Well, it sounds like what you're describing is at least the third or fourth stages of 20th century activism by the late 20th century.
Well,
A lot of people were interested in justifying the gains that activists had already made intellectually in philosophy and other areas.
Yeah.
I suppose my worry is post-2014, modern activists who fight against racism and sexism and transphobia and things like that, they don't see intellectual free inquiry as anything other than an obstacle towards what they want to do. And they're very confident that they can institutionalize new social norms primarily through fear and intimidation.
I think, I agree. A lot of it is fear. And you see this when liberal institutions capitulate sometimes their demands. Again, I don't want to exaggerate the extent of this, as some people on the right do. That's not everywhere. But yes, it does happen. People are guilt-tripped, or more likely they are scared into certain measures that are in accordance with what a certain minority of activists demand. When scholars are fired, for example, because they're on the verge of coming up with results that might threaten some sort of orthodoxy, or where speakers with views that offend a certain minority are no platformed, or at least attempts are made to stop them speaking. And sometimes institutions stand by the speakers, but at other times they don't. And they often end up with egg on their face in the end for this. But it is fear. I mean, a recent case, of course, is the case of Jess de Waal at the Royal Academy, who was just fired by, which is discovered on Twitter, that her works are no longer be sold in the Royal Academy shop because she herself been deemed transphobic.
Right.
But very quickly, it backfires because the Royal Academy just issued an apology, I think today or yesterday. Quite what they're apologising for, I don't know yet, but they have realised, I think, that they, to cancel someone, so to speak, without even letting them know first, just because they've been panicked by some tweets, is obviously not the way to go. So yes, I'm sure you're right. There's a lot of this is fear and guilt tripping, and that's toxic in itself.
Mm-hmm. Are you not confident that fear can be stable at institutionalizing new social norms?
How do you mean fear can be stabilized?
Well, I suppose I should rephrase that. Are you of the view that fear can only last so long as a way of keeping people on the same party line? Because eventually some people will become unafraid and then the whole thing will collapse.
Yeah, I think it's an empirical question, but I think there are cases when the fear has disappeared. I think in the academic world, and this is purely impressionistic because I'm semi-detached from it in a way, but, when certain things about certain issues are aired by quite courageous academics, there's a sort of pushback against them. But then as those courageous academics begin to argue their case and persuade people outside the academy, people slowly come to see, well, maybe this person had a point after all. And once a critical mass of people see that, once you realize that you're not the only person who thinks this, but lots of other people think this and haven't said so, and once you realize that you're not alone through conversations and so on, then the fear can disappear, I think. It's a bit like, although it's on a much smaller scale, it's a bit like how certain totalitarian regimes have collapsed in the past. I don't want to push the comparison too far, but when you think about how the Soviet-backed regimes collapsed in the late 1980s, places I was very interested in at the time, like Czechoslovakia, sometimes it happened when enough people realized that there were enough other people who supported their views. They slowly gained confidence until they reached a critical mass, and all of a sudden, it was possible to say it openly. It's a bit like when an orchestra goes silent quite by chance before the beginning of a concert, and the audience notice this and they go silent too, thinking that it's about to begin. And maybe it's just a natural pause in the tuning up of the instruments, but enough people get a sense of what's happening that they start to go along with it. And so, yeah, I do have some hope that fear doesn't last all that long for the reasons you point to. But it's an empirical question.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the fear, for me at least, is the fear that people who you know, people who you respect, people who can give you breaks, will find you absolutely and utterly despicable. Somebody who they want to completely keep out of polite society, in effect. The equivalent of someone who denies the Holocaust or someone who thinks rape is good. They will think that if you don't agree with whatever the latest orthodoxy is. And it seems like if that's the fear in these institutions and in popular culture and polite society, that fear is in a way a lot more effective than the individual no platformings. Like you could have 20 no platformings, but if that 20 no platformings creates a climate of fear which is exponentially larger.
Yes, that can happen, and the fear can be internalized and then I suppose forgotten. People just, certain new intellectual norms take over, and people think those are entirely normal, and people forget that there was another way of looking at these things all along. This, I think, happens when assumptions behind programs of activism or inquiry don't get questioned. It's when it's no longer possible to even ask whether the real cause of such and such an injustice is this or is that. But I think even so, there are usually enough free spirits around to break out of this and to start publishing things that gain an audience maybe outside their original sphere of influence. And especially with social media, which has made a huge difference, over the last few years. I think in the end it can crack, and it may be it's the fear of it cracking that leads to the enforcement of this fear that you talk about. The people proposing these activist programs are afraid that they actually can't defend their views rationally, so because eventually, the nonsense will come to be exposed, and so they, sensing that on the horizon, they clamp down preemptively. But I think I don't want to be too anecdotal because I'm aware there's a kind of culture war, if that's the right phrase, in academia, as well as in lots of other spheres too. And people on the left often accuse with some justification, people on the right, of exaggerating the extent of the fear and exaggerating the low platforming and just talking up a small number of instances and making it out to be the whole. And I think there's some truth in that accusation. It's not completely true, but there's truth in it. So I think we need to stick to the facts and be as evidence-based as possible. I mean, as an academic, I'm semi-detached because I'm doing part-time teaching at various places. And I certainly feel I can write what I want. But, I think, yes, there is this fear about certain sorts of unorthodoxies, but equally, when certain brave people challenge them, a lot of people follow along and they end up getting a lot of support, which is a good thing. So I haven't put this very clearly, but you see what I'm driving at?
Yeah. So one of the things that a lot of modern activists have talked about in their defense of the view of free speech you don't agree with is for people to contest the views of the new orthodoxies is to, in effect, do harm to certain groups. So they're being very Millian. They're saying, free speech is free speech unless it causes harm. They're saying if you question anything that, for instance, Black Lives Matter says or a trans activist says or certain feminists say, you are doing harm. Do you disagree with this, and why?
Well, they may be doing harm. I mean, the question is whether it's a kind of harm that justifies suppression of thought and speech. I mean, what's important about this argument is that it itself appeals to John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which, of course, classical liberals or those with a sort of liberal view of free speech will also accept in most cases. I mean, it was Mill who said that there should be no restrictions on liberty unless he includes liberty of discussion and speech, unless you're causing harm to others. And he contrasts the case of somebody who writes a pamphlet saying that corn dealers starve the poor with the case of somebody who assembles a mob outside a corn dealer's house. And almost everybody in this debate, especially when pressed, will say, there should be some limitations on free speech, libel, defamation, threats, incitement to violence, all those sorts of things. And what's the justification for those limits? Harm. So this is what some people who want to suppress or to limit speech in universities are also saying. They're saying, as you say, look, this sort of speech is harmful to a certain group. What we need to look at is the evidence for the harm, as opposed to evidence for something else, like upset or offence, which is easily confused with it. We also need to look at whether feeling offended might be a good reason for suppressing speech, and that's not as much discussed, but it is important to look at. And we also need to look at whether the harm allegedly caused is so great or so probable, and also probable, that it justifies the suppression of speech. If we take speech to be a good social norm, that we should, on the whole, presumptively be allowed to speak our minds politely and without threats and so on, then we need a good reason to suppress speech in a particular occasion. Now, that good reason could be found if you can argue that this particular speaker, or even that speaker's very presence due to their prestige and power, is so detrimental to an underprivileged group that the speaker should be suppressed. That's possible. That should be considered. But I think we have to do a lot of thinking before we get to that point. And I think that some of the examples I give in the book, and also other things that have occurred since I wrote it, should make us very careful before we declare that point has been reached. But there's certainly an argument, and I must confess I don't discuss this as much as I should have done in the book, an argument which has sometimes been traced to the notion of illocutionary silencing. That's whereby a particular group is silenced by the mere presence or the mere speech of a powerful group. And it's an interesting argument, which I want to think more about, because I touched on it briefly. I mean, the argument was first popularized, I think, in feminist anti-pornography campaigns.
Yes.
And it was made particularly, the work of Catherine McKinnon, and then that was made more accessible philosophically by Ray Langton, who said that what pornography does is silence women in various ways. For example, that it makes a woman's lack of consent to a sexual activity no longer count, because it's not believed, because within the framework of pornography, there's no such thing as lack of consent or no such thing, this sort of thing. Now, take it from that case to other cases. If somebody is always appearing on platforms saying that the reason why black people are in poorer housing or have less money is not because of any sort of white racism, it's for other causes, and they're always saying this, then you could argue that this disempowers people who actually are the victims of poor housing and so on, so from speaking up. Now, that sort of argument is not stupid. You get the same thing. I recently read a paper by a fairly left-wing philosopher arguing that climate deniers, or whatever you want to call them, should not be given a platform on the grounds that they often have such prestige, even though they know no science at all. They have such prestige among their audience that they can actually cause a lot of harm. Or COVID deniers, or COVID vaccination deniers. Maybe there is a public health case for not letting these people speak. I'm open to that. I think I'd have huge caveats about it, but it's not a stupid argument. And one thing I do try to do in the book is bring out the strength of this as well as the weaknesses. So I think, this is something that people on the so-called right, if that's the right term to use, do need to think about a bit more carefully, because the arguments aren't stupid, even if we end up being skeptical of them. As in many practical cases, I am skeptical. I think a lot of the examples I use aren't really susceptible to that sort of analysis, but they could be.
Okay. Do you have a worry that, for instance, the Black Lives Matter activists who thinks that the UK and the US are white supremacist societies, and the classical liberal just don't have the same conception of what it means to be harming an oppressed group?
Yeah. Well, I talk a little bit about it in the chapter on power, privilege, and identity, and I do need to think about it more and to read more. And I think certainly there are elements, if I've got it right, within the discipline of critical race theory, which is often, I think, falsely identified with BLM, but it is, I think, a small part of BLM, that dismisses the whole enlightenment and the whole project of free inquiry and the liberal or the autonomous individual within a liberal society as being a supremacist myth. No, I don't agree with that. I mean, I'm rather impressed by the arguments produced by writers like Helen Prockrose in her book that came out last September I forget the exact title, but
is it Cynical Theories?
Exactly, Cynical Theories, yeah, exactly. Because in that sense, I mean, I know some people on the left, the academic left, hated that book because they thought it was ill-informed and crass and really didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't agree with that because I thought, even though the writers aren't trained philosophers, I think they've grasped enough of what's going on to see that there's a sort of epistemological hijacking of liberal values going on here. That what the early civil rights movements did and what early feminists did was, in their phrase, use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. So you could say, look, I mean, here we have a supremacist system. Is there any rational justification for this? Well, the answer is no. I mean, just so we can see why racism, defined in a sensible way as discrimination on the basis of race, has no possible rational justification. It's both rationally absurd and immoral. And that's a very liberal thing to say. So if I understand CRT correctly, which I probably don't, when you find its advocates saying that the whole project of open minds and inquiry and reasoning is itself supremacist, well, they could be right, but in a way, if you try to argue with them, they've already ruled you out of court because you're trying to argue. You're wrong from the start. And so at best you reach a kind of standoff with people like this. I know that Pluckrose and Lindsay associate with postmodernism. I don't know how historically accurate that entirely is. I think a lot of people on the academic left thought they were just muddled about postmodernism. But there certainly is a way of thinking that we've all come across, which says, I can't argue with you because you start from radically different starting points. I don't accept you're liberal. And therefore, any attempt you make to argue against me is itself a symptom of your supremacism. Well, right. You get nowhere with that, even if what you're saying is true, which I don't think it is, but you just get nowhere. We need to do better.
Yeah.
And I call it the epistemological genetic fallacy. I don't know whether I coined the term. I hope I did. But, in my chapter 4, where I say, look, the problem with people who say that we shouldn't be teaching science or Christianity or the Enlightenment because it is, because it was spread to the rest of the world by colonizers, well, that may well be true. That's a historical fact. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that what they spread was somehow tainted. I mean, you shouldn't confuse what is transmitted via colonization with the means of transmission. The means of transmission may have been bad, but for all we know, what was transmitted may have been beneficial.
Right. So do you think that there is any way to get past this stalemate where you could say to somebody from CRT who believes the UK is white supremacist, you have good reasons, even given all your other beliefs, to value free inquiry and to allow your opponent to say things that you believe reinforce the oppression of a people that you're trying to fight for?
Well, I can imagine somebody in that movement agreeing with free speech, but still thinking that enlightenment ideas, if that's the right term, of objectivity and free inquiry are wrong. So you could imagine somebody saying we should have debate. You don't often find them saying that. You could imagine them saying that. But I think that what I say in the last chapter about whether the concern to defend free speech is right-wing, which is an idea that's gone around quite a lot. It's quite a curious idea. You defend free speech, so you must be a right-winger. The right response is to say, well, okay, look, if you've got left-wing views, that's fine. But if you think they're true, you must surely at some level think they're defensible by reason. Well, in that case, I'm open to that. Maybe you've got very good reason for thinking this. Let's hear the reasons. So I think it's one of these tropes which I think they haven't taken over the left. I think it's paranoid to think that the whole of the left has been hijacked by this sort of, quote, postmodernist way of thinking, probably the wrong term. But I think in academia and elsewhere, part of the media, it's got a substantial enough hold over the left to be something to worry about. We can't argue with you because the very belief in free inquiry is right-wing. I mean, you get this in polemical debates. When you talk about the argument about whether free speech is a worry, is a cause of concern in universities, you often find people, even politicians, Liberal Democrat and Labour politicians seem to have this uniform script nowadays they trot out. They say, basically, we shouldn't worry about free speech because the people who worry about these things are right-wing. Sometimes it really is that bad, at the level of argument.
Let's play devil's advocate and take this argument a bit seriously. What would you say to someone who says this? Well, left and right are always changing. So, in the 90s, when I was a kid, for instance, being in favor of free speech was considered a left-wing thing because most right-wing people wanted to do a lot of different kinds of censorship, of gangster rap, of Marilyn Manson, or whatever it happened to be. Yeah. But now it's the other way around, and now free speech is kind of a right-wing thing because most of the people calling for censorship, informally or formally, are on the left, and so the political spectrum is just changing all the time. What would you say to that?
Well, the answer is it's perfectly true that 50 years ago, free speech was associated with the left, and it was the Christian conservatives who wanted to clamp down on pornography and TV scenes that portrayed homosexuality in a positive light. The sort of thing that the campaigner Mary Whitehouse used to talk about in this country in the 60s. Well, I remember her, and I'm old enough to remember her. And I've just been writing, actually, about the gay news prosecution. In fact, I published something recently that touched on that, when she successfully prosecuted gay news for publishing a homoerotic poem about Christ that was actually, the judge found it was blasphemously libelous. So that's probably empirically true, but the arguments for and against free speech stand or fall quite dependent of who happens to be propounding. So it may well be true that 50 years ago free speech was a left-wing thing, now it's a more centrist or right-wing thing. But the strength of the arguments is untouched by that. There are very powerful arguments that have an ancestry, particularly in writers like John Milton and John Locke in the 17th century, and especially John Stuart Mill in the 19th, that have an evergreen quality. And many of the arguments I evoke in my book, particularly about things like feminism, go back to evergreen arguments that really are just good arguments that can be applied to all sorts of changing circumstances. For a kind of liberal approach, I agree with you that 50 years ago, free speech, anti-censorship was associated with the left.
Yes.
Now it isn't. I think that's right, but I don't think it touches on the strength of the arguments for censorship and free speech. It's just that the targets of censorship are now different. So whereas, say, 50 years ago, people like Mary Whitehouse were concerned to, in the gay news case, that was the prosecution of a blasphemous poem. You wouldn't get that nowadays so much. Now, the targets essentially are people who say that trans women are not women, for example. They're the people who now, to some extent, don't exaggerate it, but they're the people who get into trouble. But I think the arguments for and against free speech and free inquiry are, unless shown otherwise, fairly evergreen. Mm-hmm. It's just that in one era, the proponents of the one are left-wing, and then 50 years later, the proponents of the very same view are right-wing. But, that's just how things change.
Now, in chapter 2 of your book, you actually talk about what you just said, which is the debates around trans activism. You specifically cite Germaine Greer and the incident where she was, it's kind of a complicated story.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about what happened with Germaine Greer and why you wanted to mention this case specifically in chapter 2.
Yes. Well, I suppose what I was concerned with there is the need to delineate the distinction between harm and offence. Now, I don't say in my discussion I entirely succeeded, or indeed I probably didn't give enough attention to the idea that offence might be a good ground for disinviting someone. But what had happened in the autumn of 2015, quite a long time ago now, but similar things have happened since, is that Germaine Greer was invited to speak to Cardiff University about something that would normally sound pretty neutral and mainstream. Women and Power, The Lessons of the 20th Century was the title of the talk. But it came to light, if I've got this right, that certain people discovered that some years previously she had written things about trans women. She'd said that trans women were not really women. And then when that was discovered, there was an attempt to disinvite her from speaking to the Cardiff Student Union or whoever the audience was. I should add that she was in the end re-invited and her talk went ahead. So this was the attempt to stop her was unsuccessful. But still, that it happened at all, I think, was a cause of concern. And there was a petition signed by more than 300 people. I've got the phrase in front of me. It said, trans exclusionary views should have no place in feminism or society. Such attitudes contribute to high levels of stigma, hatred and violence towards trans people, particularly trans women, both in the UK and across the world. While debate should be encouraged, hosting a speaker with such problematic and hateful views is dangerous. Allowing Greer a platform to endorse her views helps her to perpetrate trans misogyny. So basically, it's framed charitably, it's the appeal to Mill's harm principle. She's a dangerous speaker. Now, that's not very plausible for incidental reasons. I mean, she wasn't talking about trans stuff anyway. She was talking about feminism. But anyway, I mean, suppose she had been talking about trans stuff. Would that have been a good reason to no platform her? Well, she was regarded as dangerous. And the general sort of implicature, I think, of the petition was that if she's allowed to speak, she would embolden people to behave disrespectfully or even violently towards trans people. Now, I don't think we can be sure that it wouldn't have had that effect. I don't find it plausible, but we can't be sure it wouldn't have done. But I think the problem is that, here we have a very important issue that's come to the fore even more since 2015, which is, if it's said to be true that you are whatever you take yourself to be when it comes to gender, that trans men are men and trans women are women, okay, well, let's take that seriously. What's the truth maker? What actually makes this true? What is the fact that makes it true? Now, Greer's not a philosopher. She's a polemicist, and she was entirely unapologetic, and she's powerful enough to get away with it. She said, I just don't think surgery turns a man into a woman. An unman is not necessarily a woman, she said. And she defended those views on Newsnight shortly afterwards. But we've got a really interesting theoretical issue here. If we are to make these remarks about gender, what makes it true? And there should be an open debate about it, which can be perfectly respectful. I mean, I take it what you're driving at is that there is a possibility that people might be emboldened to be violent or disrespectful or have some other negative attitude or behaviour towards trans people because of hearing people like Germaine Greer. So we've got to factor in possible harm against the general value of free speech about important societal subjects. I do an analogy here, which may not be convincing. I say, well, suppose there's some documentary on TV about an incurable fatal disease watched by millions of people. Well, it could be true that a few of those people watching with that disease might be tipped over into suicide by that documentary. It's just possible. But how far do we go with this suppression? Do we say, well, just because there might be some harm at some level, we suppress the documentary? Or, this is actually relevant to COVID. What are levels of acceptable risk? You could reduce deaths beyond a shade of a doubt by reducing speed limits to 10 miles an hour on all roads everywhere. You would reduce deaths, okay? Nobody takes that seriously because we think there's the counterbalancing value of getting to your destination quickly. So I think we have to widen the perspective. Even accepting there could be harm from hearing speech, we have to know how does that concern coalesce with all sorts of other scenarios where we do accept the possibility of harm. And we need to look at this question of risk more sort of dispassionately. But, I don't deny the potential legitimacy of the concern. about Greer.
Some of your critics here would say that where you've gone wrong in explaining Greer is it's not that what she said caused harm, it's that what she said is harm. In the sense that what she is essentially saying is that the transgender woman is a kind of con artist that's taking away other people's rights. And if you portray trans women as that, you are inviting everything from at the extreme end murder to at the low end rude behavior towards them. And that's not something that might cause harm. That just is harm. What would you say in response to that?
Well, the strength of the objection is precisely, it comes back to the causal idea, doesn't it? I mean, when you say it is harm, the idea is that it's false, let's say, that what Greer is saying is false. Okay, it might be. But why should we be concerned about somebody saying false things in front of an audience? Well, you could take a view that says that falsehood should never be tolerated, and actually there's a lot to be said for that. If somebody believes something false, that's surely a terrible thing. We should not have diversity of opinion because that implies that some opinions are false, that held are false. I suppose the thought you're articulating is that there's something intrinsically obnoxious about her opinions, and therefore obnoxious about her expressing them, quite regardless of the harm they cause. Well, if they don't cause any harm, I think the right way to deal with it is to argue against them. If they do cause harm, well, then we're back to what we've just been discussing about, how do we balance the possible harm against the importance of importance of free inquiry, free expression, about a societally very important issue.
In fairness, though, most universities would not want to host people who believe things like rape is good or the Holocaust never happened, even if those people aren't saying those things in the speeches they're particularly doing on podiums at the university, right?
They would not want that, no. I think it's a moot point whether there should be a policy of never allowing those views to be discussed in universities. I'm not sure what I think about that, actually. I think that this is an example of your example of cultural shifts about how now would exclude, say, Holocaust deniers from speaking in front of audiences when it perhaps wouldn't have done 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. All these things are difficult. I don't happen to think that Greer's views on this issue are epistemically on a par with Holocaust denial or with overt and ambiguous racism. But I think there's still an open question, I'm not sure how to solve it, about whether there should be a policy of banning certain views, if those views are already legal. I mean, if it's already legal to express those views. These things are difficult. I don't claim to have an answer to all of them.
What would you say to the argument that this is actually an example of an intractable disagreement between Greer and her opponents? Because if Greer is right, then the trans woman is a kind of con artist who is taking away other people's rights. It's important for the public to know that, to be unfrightened of saying that, to stand up against the trans woman in a way.
Yeah.
But if the other view is correct, if the trans woman really is a woman who is being oppressed because people believe Greer's views, then Greer's view is by definition harmful. So there's no way of reconciling these two positions with some sort of principle that both of them can agree to, like let's have free inquiry. What would you say to that?
Well, let's ask what Greer's position actually was. I mean, or what a position like hers, sufficiently like hers, might be. So I think that the way to rephrase a point, I don't know exactly what Greer thinks about this. Maybe she is genuinely transphobic. I don't know. Some people think she is. But the way to rephrase a point in the way that, say, other gender-critical people like Kathleen Stock might phrase it would be to say, look, we're not actually accusing trans women of deliberate impersonation or being con artists. We are saying that whether you're a man or a woman is not just a question of gender identity, or maybe not a question at all of gender identity. That's a debate we can have, but we're not saying that people should not be allowed to, or indeed encouraged to live in a way that feels comfortable to them. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is the middle ground that's getting forgotten in this whole debate. I think it's coming to the fore again because of the fallout after, say, Kathleen Stock, the transgender critical philosopher, mm-hmm. Whom I've known since the late 1990s, and I can say I don't believe she's any kind of bigot or anything like that. But when she got an OBE in January this year, there was a backlash against that, saying that was harmful for the people. But she's always been saying that it's not a question of trying to restrict the way people live, except in certain circumstances where there's a clash of interests or where there might be a conflict of interests. Mm-hmm. Say, rapists who become or are trans women being put into women's prisons, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty clear there is a problem with things like that, even if the incidents have been exaggerated in some quarters.
Okay, what would you say to the objection that the middle ground position that you're describing, where you tell the trans person to live however you like, dress however you like, call yourself whatever you want to be called, that middle ground position is still transphobic because it's compatible with somebody saying, yes, do all those things, but I still don't have to accept that you are what you say you are. And so it is still transphobic.
Well, that's what people say about Kathleen Stock and others, and I don't think that's true. I think, I take transphobic to mean having a fear or revulsion or hatred towards trans people, something of that sort. Now, it may well be possible that people can be unconsciously transphobic, just as they can be unconsciously racist. But I just don't think it is a sign of hate or revulsion to say that somebody is under a misapprehension about whether they're a man or a woman, if that's the right way to put it. It might be evidence of transphobia in the sense that the only explanation for somebody thinking that might be some revulsion or dislike at some deep level. It could be evidence of it, but I don't think it is intrinsically transphobic. I mean, I think there's a very important issue about what it is that makes, for example, me a man. Is it because I feel a certain way, or is it because I have a certain sort of body, or is it, as I suggest in my discussion of this, could it be some sort of hybrid? I mean, they're fascinating questions. Mm-hmm. Now, I know some trans people, one trans philosopher I know in particular, is very impatient with regarding this as a philosophical discussion because it's too disengaged, it's even condescending. But I think that it is actually a philosophical issue. What is it that makes somebody a man or a woman, mm-hmm. or a girl or a boy? And it seems quite irrational to try to suppress discussion of that.
Do you think perhaps the problem is the word transphobia, like homophobia, is misleading? Yeah. We don't actually mean hate or revulsion when we use these terms. We mean unfair discrimination that may or may not be motivated by hate.
Well, if that's what they mean by transphobia, I mean, the trouble is that when words change their meanings, they often retain the emotional resonance of the earlier meaning. And yes. So now it becomes impossible to discuss whether any discrimination in any circumstances would be justified because, it can't be because it's phobic. And you have to be very careful of those moves. But okay, if the claim is that people like Greer are transphobic in the sense that they advocate unjust discrimination against trans people, well, then the question is immediately opened up. Well, what exactly are they advocating and what makes it unjust? Now, the vast majority of gender-critical people I've come across, either personally or on Twitter, are not, as far as I can see, phobic in the traditional sense of the word. I mean, some may be, but don't admit it, but they don't seem to be. They think live whatever way is comfortable, that's fine, but we might have to, to find a way of resolving conflicts of interest. Now, if there's a conflict of interest, say, the stuff that Kathleen Stock talks quite a lot about is trans women in sports, women's sports, prison and so on, then you have to say, well, okay, suppose we are planning to discriminate against trans women in women's prisons, but supposing we're going to say we want to be very careful before putting trans women in women's prisons, especially if they've been sex offenders, then the question is, okay, it's discrimination, yes. But then you argue that the discrimination here is justified. Now, the arguments there may be good or they may not be. The obvious argument is that, and there's evidence of this, that when male sex offenders who transition are put in women's prisons are put in obvious danger. Same with refugees. Now, we can debate that. But the idea that any sort of discrimination, understood neutrally, must be unjust, begs questions. I mean, we have to ask why. Discrimination in many contexts is just. I mean, a jury is meant to discriminate guilty people from innocent people. An art critic's meant to discriminate good from bad art. We need to know, okay, it's discriminatory. We need a further argument for saying it's unjust. Maybe it is unjust. Maybe the argument can be found. But the question can't be closed off. Mm-hmm. I think it's where you want to go.
What would you say to somebody who says that, and I'm not saying this personally, I'm trying to imagine what a critic of yours might say, that the reality is you don't actually accept transgenderism, because transgenderism just is the idea that categories like male and female are felt identities that are determined by feelings. And the justification for that is the suffering that happens when you don't allow them to be determined by feelings.
Yeah.
Since you're implicitly, at least, denying that, you don't accept transgenderism, but you're trying to say that you're not transphobic because you don't hate trans people, but that's not what trans activists want. They want you to accept transgenderism. What would you say to that?
I mean, if you're referring to what I say in chapter 3 about this, gender identity in a sense, I've got a few pages, that's a separate section from the stuff on Greer. I think what I say there is actually quite tentative and cautious. I'm aware of the argument that whether you're a man or a woman is really a question of a sort of inner sense or feeling, an inner sense of gender identity. I don't actually accept it because I don't see any rational reason to accept it. But I also say that there could be a good argument for it. And I've come to think later that maybe, probably understood, these concepts are hybrid concepts. Maybe the concept man and woman is not entirely simple, that maybe there's an element of biology, an element of gender identity. I mean, that's possible. I mean, and I actually tried to construct an argument for the transgender view, for the view just enunciated, when I say, well, maybe what it is to be a man or a woman is a little bit like what it is to be dead. We used to have a fairly, rough and ready test for when you've died, which is when your heart stopped, when your breathing stopped, and that normally indicated that you were dead. But with the advance of medical science and EEGs and so on, you can separate the concept of death from the concept of the death as respiratory or heartbeat death. It's now something else, it's brain death. So maybe what it is to be a man or a woman is, after all, something that is not empirically obvious. I mean, having a male body might be very good evidence that you're a man, but it wouldn't be conclusive proof that you're a man, or it wouldn't conceptually entail you're a man. And when you think about the fact that, most people who just regard themselves as men or women because they have a certain body are not arguably aware of any gender identity that makes a man or a woman. They're just aware of having a certain sort of body. I think the case has to be made for this. So, yeah, to that extent, I'm not convinced of what you call transgenderism.
Okay. So what would you say to the critic who says what justifies these claims about male and female categories being determined by feelings is that if you hold your view, if you don't allow them to be completely determined by feelings, you cause tremendous amounts of suffering and potentially depression and suicides for which you are responsible if you don't hold the view that ameliorates the suffering, that is transgenderism. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, distinguish two things. I mean, I don't think anybody has to be harmed in that way by knowing that other people disagree that they are what they claim to be. I think if, though, you're suggesting that the people who disagree would want to stop people with those feelings from adjusting their lives to make them more comfortable, well, I don't agree that anybody should be stopped from surgery or whatever sort of changes or adjustments to lifestyle may be necessary. I'm a live and let live sort of person when it comes to that. And I don't really have a dogmatic view about it. I was really in that chapter trying to explore the various angles of this issue. I mean, you could define being a man or woman in any way you want. And you could say, okay, let's just now define it in terms of having this inner sense, this inner gender identity. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, you get, you go down the route of being non-binary because people can be a bit of one, a bit of another, or maybe at weekends they can be one, weekdays they can be other. You get all that. it becomes very nebulous. There's possibly something in it. But I think that the point being made by gender-critical feminists, which I think is substantially justified, if not entirely, is that biology does have a legitimate social importance in our lives, and particularly in things like sexual relations. I think most people, Kathleen Stocks argued this provocatively, when you are attracted to somebody sexually, it's usually because they have a certain sort of body. Most people aren't generally attracted to somebody because they have a certain gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
It's an empirical issue, maybe they are. Most, I think, are not. So all attempts to say, well, biology is irrelevant to it, do in the end seem quite arbitrary, and we need a reason for that exclusion. And still often we don't find that reason, we just find it asserted that you are whatever you feel yourself to be.
What would you say to the argument against the gender-critical feminist that if you, say, are a lesbian and you only want to have sex with people who have vaginas, that means you are also a transphobic bigot because you lived in a society that up until now was transphobic, and that's why you have the feelings you do about penises, when actually if you became less transphobic, if you became more enlightened, then your feelings would change.
Well, you might want to try to change your feelings along those lines, and you might be successful. I've never myself seen how one's sexual inclinations can be properly assessed for bigotry. We fancy certain sort of people, we don't fancy certain sort of other people. It may be that certain prejudices inform that, and if you're aware of those prejudices, you might manage to change who you're attracted to, just as, for example, men growing older might just have to adjust themselves to the fact that they're less likely to have success with young women than they perhaps once were, and a reasonable adjustment would be to take that into account. But I can't see how one's own sexual inclinations can in themselves manifest bigotry or prejudice. And I think that's one, you hear stories occasionally, no doubt exaggerated, of trans women who consider themselves lesbians demanding to have sex with other lesbians who are cis women. You get, the demand, as opposed to request or desire, strikes me as unreasonable. Demanding that somebody should have an orientation that they don't actually have. I mean, the fact is, and Kathleen Stock makes it quite clear, lesbians, as such, are attracted to female-bodied people, not to people with a female gender identity. There may be some who are, I don't know, it does become an empirical issue. But in general, that's simply the case. And I don't see how they can be accused of bigotry for this. So I'm sure you could have even cleverer arguments to suggest that they should be, but...
What would you say about, let's say, an argument coming from the other side, which says that given that transgenderism, the concept, seems to be making so many unreasonable demands on the rest of society, so many demands that have the potential to cause suffering, whether that's in the form of restricting people's freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, taking their children away from them if they don't want to allow their children to transition, putting female bodybuilders or boxers in competitions with transgender female bodybuilders and boxers and so on. That given all of these different types of harm and suffering that transgenderism itself has the potential to do to the rest of society, we shouldn't be defending the idea that we're not transphobic. We should be attacking transgenderism as an idea. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't think it's... even suppose it's true that there are certain societal harms that come from accommodating transgender people, and I think that's plausible in certain circumstances. I don't think that means that we should be... you might want to attract transgenderism intellectually. You might want to say, well, it's just not a view you can defend. But I don't think it means that people haven't got a right to hold the view or express the view. I mean, it could be true. I mean, I'm not convinced myself, but it could be. So I think I would worry there that the backlash against it is producing a kind of bigotry of its own by saying that, if it's suggesting that we shouldn't recognize in any way what used to be called gender dysphoria, feeling a sort of dissonance between your gender identity and your body. My own view is that although there's a great danger of misdiagnosis and, to do with all the scandals about the Tavistock and so on we've read about, people who are properly thought to be in that condition should be given whatever help they request, and that might include surgery, bodily adjustments, all those sorts of things. And I don't think we actually need to get into the question of whether the transgenderist philosophy, as you describe it, is correct. Here we have a discomfort that we can that there's a way to ameliorate without impacting on the interests of any other people. I mean, if your thought is the idea now from the right, as it were, that transgenderism is it in itself a harmful idea? That's the thought. It could be a false idea. Whether it's a harmful idea, I think depends on lots of other things. Whether any harms will come from enacting it or from imposing it on people, as opposed to reaching some sort of agreement or compromise where different interests are concerned. And I think in the end, it's a question of truth or falsity, and it's a metaphysical issue. And although some trans people don't like me talking like this, I think it is genuinely interesting and philosophically discussable, like all these things. They get hijacked by polemicists, and it's important to discuss it fairly and openly and freely and without wrath or ire.
And speaking of another incident that you brought up in your book, in which certain ideas were not, at least in a certain context, allowed to be discussed without a lot of rage and anger from activists, you write quite eloquently about the 2015 incident with Nicholas Christakis and Halloween costumes. Would you mind explaining to our listeners what that was about? Because that's one of my favorite culture war videos of the last 10 years.
It's one of these things that were much discussed at the time, and I think it's fading into the background. And actually, I'm quite pleased if it is, because I should say, incidentally, I have a sort of niggling sense that these culture wars might be on the retreat now. I mean, because so much has been said that on all sides about it. I mean, so many polemics have been articulated that we're getting tired of it. But what happened in 2015, if I recall, is that there was a sort of outbreak of protests at Yale University because there was an email that went out from the assistant master at one of the colleges, Erica Christakis, saying that people should discuss civilly what Halloween costumes they should wear for Halloween. And of course, the background of this is that in the past there were people dressed in blackface and so on, and that's, by common consensus, is a racist thing to do and shouldn't go on. So it's about possibly racist Halloween costumes. And Erica Christakis sent a rather mild and gentle email saying, well, just discuss among yourselves. Don't expect the answer to be imposed from on high. Don't expect administrations to tell you what you should wear. And then there was I've read 3 accounts of this, and possibly the accounts I've read are biased, but there was an eruption on the campus when people demanded that Erica Christakis and eventually her husband, Nicholas Christakis, should be fired for racism and for saying that, for just ignoring the whole history of oppression that lies behind this issue about Halloween costumes. And this led to a lot of unpleasantness. And I mean, there were the two philosophers, Jason Stanley and Kate Mann, published an influential article in the Chronicle of Higher Education around the same time, saying that it was a complete mistake to think that these students were being coddled or childish in protesting. In reality, they are not suppressing anybody's free speech. They are not advocating the end of free speech. They're simply advocating for free speech for hitherto marginalized groups, which you could say is plausible enough. I mean, and they'll say, look, I mean, once people are oppressed for long enough, it boils over into rage. And the Halloween business at Yale was the boiling over into overt rage of decades or centuries of oppression of marginalized groups. Who can blame them? Now, what I say about that is it could be true that they are sincerely, I mean, the Yale thing wasn't directly about free speech, but it was adjacent to it. The protesters were sincerely trying to increase the freedom to speak of hitherto marginalized groups. But to say that, therefore, in so doing, they have never encroached on the free speech of other groups struck me as disingenuous. So it's all very well to come out openly and say, yes, we do believe that certain powerful people should be silenced, for at least for a while, in order to let marginalized people speak. What you shouldn't say, as those also seem to say at that point, is that we're not really trying to silence anyone, or the students aren't really trying to silence anyone. They're just asserting the right to freedom of speech of the marginalized. And I think that's, I don't know exactly what they meant, but there's a danger of being disingenuous when you say that sort of thing.
So is the disingenuousness, you think, coming from the fact that implicit in their view, there's a sort of zero-sum conception of speech?
Yeah.
where
I think,
their opponents either have speech and they don't, or they have speech and their opponents don't. Something like that.
I think that is implicit. And it may not be entirely false, because I mentioned earlier on something I would like maybe to explore later when I get to think about it. The whole cluster of arguments around illocutionary silencing, the very presence of people with power and prestige speaking confidently, having a silencing or chilling effect on people without those privileges. Yeah, I mean, I do take that seriously. And incidentally, it's the very thing that people are now saying on the right about left-wing censorship. It's now chilling conservatives in universities. They can't speak, and because the left is so powerful. It's the same argument. And for that reason, I take it seriously. But I don't think it has to be zero-sum, though. I think that, when you look at the context of these silencings and these demonstrations, when you look at the issue about what these speakers are going to be saying, when you look at the often very liberal environment they're speaking in, it doesn't always look very plausible to say that it's reasonable to silence them in order to allow the marginalized to speak. I mean, in the abstract, it sounds very plausible, but there's too much sort of shoving people into implausible categories of either powerful or powerless that's going on with this. In practice, it should be perfectly possible to let people who represent powerful groups from saying certain things that others disagree with, without thereby silencing people from less powerful groups who disagree with it. I mean, sure, you need gatekeeping, but ideally you want everybody to be given the chance to speak.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any problems? And I sometimes have problems with this, although it's very difficult to find anybody who shares my problems.
Oh dear, well, shall we all find that?
Do you think that there is a problem with saying that there are groups of people where one group has more power than the other, and therefore the ethical thing to do is to redistribute the power? Isn't that almost a bit like confusing power with money and doing some sort of a taxation scheme?
Well, it's multifaceted, this one. When you say that some groups are more powerful than others, you're not saying that every member of that group is more powerful than every member of the other group. And I don't think anybody really is saying that, or should be. If they are saying that, they're obviously confused. But it's a straw man position easily attacked from the right to say, are you really saying that every white person is more powerful than every black person? Look at this black millionaire. Okay, that's not what's being said. We're talking about averages, and we're talking about there being a history behind these average power differentials. And now the claim is that there should be some leveling of the playing field. Now, I don't know. I think that clearly there are cases where things have to be done. to rectify power differentials, but they must also be sensitive to individual differences along the way, and sensitive to the likely multiplicity of causes of those power differentials. And once you get into those issues in a spirit of, truthful inquiry, you usually find that the issue is more complicated than presented by many sort of activists. And you also find, on the whole, that a great many members of the allegedly powerful group are quite sympathetic to what is being said by those of the less powerful groups. I mean, think how many white people have been converted to the anti-racist cause, for example. Think about Black Lives Matters, that they're very largely white people on those demonstrations in London. So maybe I'm losing track of your question a bit, but I think that taken out of the abstract and put into concrete practicalities, the issue,
Well, I suppose the worry I have is whenever people talk about the fact that they want to fight on behalf of a powerless group or less powerful group than another by taking something away from the more powerful group, normally they're trying to take away something that nobody should try and take away from anyone, like the right to wear whatever Halloween costumes you want. That isn't to say that you shouldn't have to face the consequences of wearing a Halloween costume that someone else might find grossly offensive on an individual level. But the idea that you shouldn't be allowed to wear costumes because a supposedly less powerful group will find them offensive, that just strikes me as crazy. But maybe I'm crazy. I don't know.
No, it's not crazy. I mean, there's the issue of principle and the issue of whether a particular case really comes under the problem you're talking about. I mean, for example, I remember talking about this sort of thing with a class of American students, because before the pandemic, I was teaching all American students from Fordham University. And this issue came up, and they were talking about a Halloween party when there was some horror that somebody was dressed as a sort of jihadist hijacker, dressed in Saudi sort of gear. And they didn't like that. They thought that was outrageous because they're giving the impression that all Saudis are somehow terrorists or jihadists. And I want to say, well, actually, looked at through the lens of, call it common sense or whatever, would you really think a reasonable interpretation of somebody turning up dressed in Saudi sort of traditional garb was trying to give and with machine guns, was trying to give the impression that all Saudis or all Arabs did this? I don't think a reasonable person would interpret that as being the message. So I think in practice, a lot of these disputes are overblown, and they become a way, objecting to these things become a way, if you like, of signalling one's purity or one's anti-racism. But in cases when there really are offensive, offensive costumes or offensive, insignia or whatever, I just think the issue is considered in the abstract. That can be, but when you look at the kind of cases that come to our attention where this has been done, it becomes, I have a sense of a lot more need for nuance in those discussions. Perhaps that's my ideological bias, but that's what I sense.
I mean, one of the interesting things is I am, as you can see, a person of color. I'm Mexican-American. So one thing that people often assume about me is that I would be very offended if we went to a Halloween party together and you showed up wearing a sombrero.
Sombrero, that came up a few years ago, didn't it? Yeah, well, that's a bit like the case of but even better case than the one I just illustrated about the Saudi jihadists. See, this is how, the right overblows this by saying, look how ridiculous the left is. All they can talk about is sombreros. The left, in the first place, gets in this trouble because they do react with this strange sort of sensitivity you talk about, and it gets involved in things like cultural appropriation, as if culture were not something that could be shared universally, but had to be transferred from one group to another. So, I agree, the sombrero thing looked ridiculous.
But in a way, if someone assumes, which they often do, that I would take offense at you wearing a sombrero because I come from a less powerful group in England, that almost feels like it's homogenizing me. It's saying that I have a kind of group consciousness and I'm sort of implicitly identitarian and left-wing in this specific way, just in virtue of my brown skin. And to me, that actually feels much more racist to me.
So assuming you must have a certain view because you are of a certain ethnicity.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. I suppose that the charitable way to interpret what's going on would be to say that somebody thinks you might have that view, or that, you don't want, it's best to assume you don't want to be stereotyped as a Mexican by people wearing sombreros and so on. So we learn a side of caution. But again, it comes back to my point about the nuanced practicality. Sometimes you find that you get reports sometimes of people feeling very afraid to speak to people who are of obviously different ethnic group to them because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing in some way. But what tends to transpire is that, as you just said, you might be stereotyping that person by assuming they must have a certain set of political or social views just because they are from that group. And they might well not. And once the ice is broken with discussion of those things, it often turns out that they don't have that view, or they do, but in a much more nuanced way than you thought. And the ice can be broken. So, yeah, I take that point too.
Do you think in general it's best for whatever is offensive or non-offensive in terms of Halloween costumes to be determined organically, just by kind of the basic social norms that are derived from how people act on the ground level, rather than activists trying to insert their own social norms into what everybody else has to do?
Well, activists are trying to argue about what those norms should be, and they have every right to do that. And they're also probably right to say that organic change is often determined by who has the power already. So it's never quick enough or never complete enough. But in general, I think, again, at a sort of ground level, change does take place organically. You know, people come to realize that certain sort of jokes are not really that funny. People come to realize that Holocaust denial is not just an interesting sort of eccentric historical view, but one which is actually an arm of anti-Semitism in all the occasions when it manifests itself. So I think there is that organic change. And I think on the whole, society is happier and better if we allow for the value of that organic change, as opposed to attempts to impose it from above by activists, as opposed to encourage it. But I don't know. I mean, I have to think about these things, you know, in much more detail. But they're all good questions, I think.
I mean, as a general rule, though, it sounds like, on the whole, you're quite sympathetic to activists in terms of what they want to do. It's the implementation strategies that you have worries about. Would you say that's fair?
I don't know. I'm quite agnostic about a lot of this. And I'm also aware of how what I say or seem to say might be received in my own circle. So I was being a little bit cautious. And in fact, writing a book made me quite anxious at times because, you know, could this be construed in this way or that way? Or so-and-so whom I know and respect might think this or that. I'm trying to be, I mean, I'm sympathetic to certain sort of liberal versions of activism. So, you know, first and to some extent, second-wave feminism I have some sympathy with, you know, merely saying that being a man or a woman is not a good reason for being denied certain social privileges or the satisfaction of certain interests you have. With the transgender stuff, I'm open to persuasion about what being a man or a woman essentially consists in. So I do have, I mean, I don't like the way that the right has, in certain circles, has leapt on these things and under the guise of attacking left-wing extremism is now promoting certain rather, you know, dubious and sometimes unpleasant views of its own. At the same time, I think that I'm a skeptic. I mean, I've never been a socialist, for example, whatever my uncle may have thought of that. You know, I've never had a view of that sort. I've never been a totalizer. I think we need to look open-mindedly at all sorts of views and look for the hidden truth in them, if it is that hidden. So I'm I suppose, if anything, I think I'm relatively left of centre economically. I'm probably quite centre socially. I never quite worked out what I am. I don't want to be pigeonholed. So I want to be fair to the activists you talk about, but I also want to call out some of the absurd beliefs some of them have about the epistemological versions of identity politics, as well as some of the intolerance and the wacky empirical claims that they often make. I think that all these things have to be discussed in the open.
Do you accept the activist claim that the activists, at least the 2021 activists who fight on behalf of those issues you mentioned, that they are the underdogs with the smallest amount of power? Or are you more sympathetic to the idea that it's the people on the other side of the activists who are the underdogs with these issues?
Well, this itself is a polarizing issue, isn't it? Because it depends in what circles you move. I mean, I got into some spats on Facebook about a year ago when I was talking about things that arose out of, well, probably originally Black Lives Matter, but also when the atmosphere on social media was quite heated about those things. And I think I circulated something about a policy exchange report about free speech in universities, which suggested that there was too much left-wing activism, too much left-wing suppression of free speech in universities. And I said, okay, it could be something there. Somebody angrily got back to me and said, don't you realize that the real threat in the world at large is from the right? Why do you keep going on about free speech in universities? This is just a marginal distraction. And I want to say, well, actually, yes, I do. And I say in the book, I do think that worldwide, the greater threat to liberal values is from the right. But in the particular circles that I know best, like academic circles and maybe slightly media circles, there's a problem on the other side. Now, I don't want to overstate that problem, but I think there is a problem with the left in academia. It's getting better because some people are now speaking out against it. And I don't think it should ever be overestimated in the first place. But there is a problem in those circles. And just because, in Donald Trump's America or in Brazil or Russia or Hungary or Poland or, all these places, the right's on the ascendant, that doesn't mean there's no problem on the left. I think, let's be clear, you say I'm sympathetic to activism. Up to a point I may be in some ways, but I do think there's a real threat from the left or parts of the left in certain circles. Academia is one area. I read the policy exchange and the Civitas reports because I've just written a paper on the state of free speech in universities. On the whole, most academics are quite liberal. Some are fairly liberal-minded but don't want to speak up against certain trends because they fear being demonized. But on the whole, enough people share my views in academia for me to have some confidence. But there are still pockets of a problem, particularly on certain issues where speakers have been disinvited, speech codes have been elaborately constructed to make people disagree with them feel uncomfortable, and so on.
Yes, and this is something that you kind of deal with in the third chapter, Subjective Authority and Unwelcome Facts.
Yeah.
When you talk about free inquiry, free expression, and the importance of those things in the discovery of truth. And then you talk a bit about relativism.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm interested in is, do you think that this sort of relativism that you're discussing in this chapter, is this coming primarily from the left, or is this a kind of broader thing that you're seeing in the academy or pop culture even?
I was talking more about pop culture, and I didn't try to define relativism precisely, except in certain contexts. So there was a detour into moral relativism because I thought that'd be a good way of just focusing the issue of relativism in general. I think with reasonably clearly, it's the view there's no such thing as one true moral system, but that different customs or codes are true for one group and a different set are true for another group. And that's not a stupid view. And in fact, relativism in general has a fairly respectable intellectual ancestry. You find it in Protagoras, you find it in 19th century anthropologists. It's not stupid. And in some areas of inquiry, it's probably true. But I think what's happened is that a half-baked version of it has got into the culture at large, possibly from applied postmodernism as called by, Pluckrose and Lindsay, and that's probably part of it. There's a sort of, you get a sort of cultural lift, or what's the phrase? You feel you're saying the right thing if you say things like, "Oh, that's just my opinion," but what's true for you may be different, or that's her view, but it's only opinion. I often discuss with the students, because many of them say this sort of thing, and I ask them what they actually mean when they say, "Oh, this is my view, but it's just my view," and they'll say, in the end, it turns out that they just want to be polite, or they don't want to appear dogmatic, and that's often what's really going on. It's not they really think there's no truth, but I think that when I linked it with the right, the irony that when people like Kellyanne Conway, Donald Trump's special counselor, can talk about alternative facts. I mean, part of the reason I suspect for the success of that sort of rhetoric, somebody defending obvious lies by calling them alternative facts, is that there's a kind of cultural receptivity to the idea that there are facts and then there are other facts, and somehow that neither set of facts are better than any other. It's never articulated properly, because if you articulated it and asked why we should believe it, the nonsense will be revealed quite quickly. So these things, they better not be articulated. They better be left as moods or airs. So I think the right, in a way, inadvertently has seized on to this. Donald Trump can create his own reality. He can say, well, they say they say that I'm behind the fake media, but they're just the left-wing fake media, another kind of fake media. Choose your fake media. And that, I think, is something quite dangerous. I don't think that postmodernists, if it's them, did this deliberately. And I think there are always interesting arguments for these positions, particularly perhaps with Foucault. And there's always something interesting behind it. But when it gets passed on at 10th hand and repeated without any real thought, and they become cultural tropes, reality is just what we take it to be. There's no objective reality. That sows the seeds for a lot of malfeasance on the right as well as the left. Mm-hmm. And these, I think, particularly the right.
Okay, so are you starting from the assumption that the mainstream media that was covering Trump was not accurately described as a left-wing media, that's actually a kind of unbiased, centrist, fair, decent media covering a lunatic liar? Is that your view?
No, I don't think they were all necessarily a left-wing media. And I think that what I think is that, well, there's no doubt Donald Trump is a liar, and I think he's a malignant narcissist, actually. But that needn't matter. We don't want to make it just about the man. There's a movement that he represents. Now, I think that movement is able to latch onto certain truths while making grotesque errors about other things. I think a lot of people who criticize that, some of them were quite balanced and centrist. Others were from a sort of obviously left-wing camp, an obviously camp that was determined, I think that's what you're driving at, determined to hate Trump whatever he said. And I think Trump noticed that, and he called them a left-wing fake news media. I mean, when I was in America last in 2017, I was in hotel rooms, channel hopping, looking at the coverage. I mean, I remember in one hotel, the only channel I could get was Fox or something. So, right, I know about Fox. But in the other ones, the CNN ones, you've got a different narrative, different buzz phrases. But my impression was that the depth of discussion wasn't actually a great deal better. It was just they said different things and they pressed different buttons. But there wasn't a great deal of analysis. So I think the right may be onto something when they say that a lot of this left-wing stuff they call the fake news is not really, it's actually just as prejudiced, or it is significantly prejudiced. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. I think America, I suspect, in a fairly sorry state of affairs when it comes to public discussion. No, I was just saying, I think you were saying that I was suggesting I was unfairly downplaying the partisanship of the left, and I appeared to be defending them against Donald Trump's attacks. I don't think I am denying the irrational partisanship of a lot of the left. Mm-hmm. In fact, I have been writing about, my book is partly about that.
Yes. Okay. What would you say to the argument that Trump is a paradox? Because rather than being a systematic liar, he's someone for whom truth is something that he will use when it's useful to him. And that's quite different from being a systematic liar.
It is. I'm reminded of the fairly well-known essay by Harry Frankfurt called On Bullshit.
Yes.
Yes. Now, that's the enticing idea. What Frankfurt says is that the bullshitter is somehow unconcerned whether what he says is true or false. He just says what's useful. So a salesman might be a bullshitter. But I think that's not quite accurate, because I think that, bullshitters do often lie. They do often say things they know to be false. Mm-hmm. They're just not concerned about the fact that they're saying what they know to be false. And I agree, there is a state of mind, you might call it the bullshit mentality. where you do somehow lose sight of the distinction between truth and falsity. You're not even asking the question, is this true? But if you were to ask it, probably in a few seconds you'd realize that what you're saying is not entirely true. Now, I think Trump, I am not a psychologist. I can't inspect the man's mind. There is such a thing as self-deception. Mm-hmm. And it's quite possible, for example, that Trump genuinely believes he won the election. I mean, I don't know. It's quite possible he believes this. Maybe he started out not believing it, but maybe it was so intolerable for him not to, that he just decided on a certain narrative. Right. I just don't know. What I do think, though, is that whether consciously or not, there is, I talk about this in that chapter about fake news. There's a very alarming decline of trust and an alarming sense that once world leaders notice that other world leaders are untrustworthy, they see no reason to be trustworthy themselves. Mm-hmm. There's a good article in the Sunday Times just 3 days ago by Matthew Syed about this, about the West's real problem being a lack of trust. People can't trust anybody in cooperative enterprises anymore.
Yeah.
That I think is enticing, and I think there is a lack of public trust.
Exactly.
I think on the left, you get,
One of the things that passage made me think about was how in every movie where there's a psychopath who does horrible things, they always give a very left-wing explanation of capitalism first. And say capitalism is horrible, and this is why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, well, you get that sort of thing, and you can get it on the other side too. I mean,
cynicism. Yeah, cynicism tends to bring out the worst in people who want an excuse to bring out the worst in themselves.
Yes, and you notice a phenomenon of projection, whereby people are very good at identifying their own worst flaws in other people. Now, I'm not a psychoanalyst or anything like that, but it's quite remarkable how perceptive people can be, how particularly perceptive people can be of their own exact faults when they notice them in other people. So the irony, for example, of narcissists noticing narcissism in other people, saying, she's a real narcissist. She's always, posting images on Instagram, There's something, Freud is onto something here when he talked about projection. And I think there's a lot of this going on in culture wars. When I talk about virtue signaling, maybe we'll just talk about it next time, but, I think there is actually a virtuous side to virtue signaling on the one hand. Sometimes it's perfectly appropriate to signal your virtue because you need to signal the fact you're trustworthy. Mm-hmm. And moreover, when you're making a legitimate moral point, to be accused of virtue signaling is just a way of ignoring the moral point you're making. But on the other hand, there really is such a thing as obnoxious virtue signaling. And sometimes it takes the form of presenting yourself as very morally pure and noticing what's actually worst about yourself in others, like their intolerance or their bigotry and so on. And it's a dangerous trend that's been on the rise, I think, since these culture wars began.
Yes, that's interesting. Going back to Trump for a bit.
Yeah.
There is an interesting criticism of the way that you've portrayed him in the book, which is something like a systematic liar propagandist. A lot of people would say he's more like a bullshitter than a systematic liar propagandist.
Yeah.
And the important thing is you shouldn't always assume the bullshitter is wrong. The bullshitter might be quite right about quite a lot of important things. Yeah. Like, for instance, he said the virus came from a Chinese lab, Hunter Biden's laptop was real, Lafayette Square was not cleared for a photo op, the Russian bounty story was false, the vaccines were produced before 2020 in record time, the blue state lockdowns weren't very effective, critical race theory is bad for education, the southern border security strategy of Biden isn't that great, he predicted that, he talked about the problems with misandry and due process for young men in colleges, he talked about the problems of free speech, he talked about the problems of globalism. And because he's a bullshitter rather than a systematic liar, people have at their peril ignored a lot of important things he had to say, even though he was bullshitting.
Yeah, sure. I'm not an expert on Trump or American politics, and my book wasn't mostly about that. But I think you're right to a significant extent. These sort of demagogues often are onto something they've grasped at an intuitive level, especially if they're in tune with their own grassroots. So, one of the examples you mentioned is you're alluding to the Betsy DeVos amendments to college campus rape allegations?
Yes.
Because there had been a period under Obama when I think I fairly reliably read that there were some horrific cases of men being suspended from college without any proper process because some allegation had been made against them. And I think that I don't want to overstate the instance of it or downplay the importance of eliminating sexual assault and so on. But it's fairly clear from my reading that there were these cases of blatantly unjust overridings of due process. And that happened after Obama's letter to faculties. Now, I mean, DeVos, I think they noticed this and they put this right. Of course, this can be portrayed by the left as yet another attempt to roll back feminism or another attempt to roll back women's rights. It's actually not that. It's actually an attempt to restore justice and due process. But according to to the other things that the people speaking the truth about that have done, one will assess the credibility of what's being done. So you're right. Certain good things and certain wise things can be said by demagogues. But with people like Trump, it's all a muddle because it's obvious that you couldn't really have a rational conversation about anything with him because everything was about himself and he would bluster and change the subject and insult and all those things that made it difficult. But yeah, I mean, I'm very critical of Trump in what I say, but I don't want to say that Trump a priori could have done nothing right. Not my view.
Yeah. Do you ever worry that we could arrive at a paradox where on the one hand you've got a demagogue bullshitter in the style of Trump, but who is on the right side of history while the factually correct mainstream media is on the wrong side of history?
It's possible. I mean, how are we going to characterize these two sides? Are we going to say that the one side is analytic and fact-based and presents arguments coolly and the other side just makes up the truth and just bullshits? I mean, a lot depends on how we come to apprehend the important truth in the first place. And I mean, about 3 years ago, I read Enlightenment by Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, which taught me actually more about moral philosophy, my alone alleged subject, than any number of academic articles in moral philosophy.
I love that book too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it has many critics, but I liked it. It's brilliantly written, and some of the analogies are fantastic. There's the elephant and the rider analogy he has early on. So the rider is the intellectual bit of you that does the thinking, and the elephant is the intuitive, instinctive bit. And the elephant is likely to be right about certain things. I mean, for example, we've evolved to be quite good at threat detection, physical threats. We notice when people, that's intuitive, it's not process. But when it comes to things we need to think about carefully, like, statistics and their application to vaccinations and so on, the elephant is not going to do the work. What you need, of course, is both. But it's possible that, I mean, one thing that Haidt says in that book, which is quite illuminating, is that he'd been advising the Democrats in about 2012, I think, in their election campaign, or maybe 2008 in their election campaign, saying, look, what you say may be true, but it's boring. You just got people trotting out statistics about this and that and facts. People want to hear stories and anecdotes. If you're going to persuade people, you're trying to persuade an audience, you don't start off by reading off facts about this or that or statistics. Say something like, let me tell you about my grandmother, and then you've got their attention, and about your anecdotes could be it's going to, strike a chord. Never mind the fact that somebody else can tell a different story about another grandmother. You have to combine both. So you're right. There are certain things that the right possibly do get intuitively better than the left do. I think that's very likely to be true. I can't speculate now what they are. But at the same time, when you're trying to find facts about climate change or COVID or religion or whatever, you do unfortunately have to do the hard thinking. I'd recommend Daniel Kahneman's approach. I mean, fast and slow thinking that articulates the merits of both and the difficulties of combining both in the same mind. I tried that right in my book. I felt constantly there were tensions within me between left and right, between, this is a good argument, but hold on, a very clever person I know would say this. It was difficult. I felt a lot of tension while thinking about these things.
I mean, one of the things that I got as an impression from reading the chapters in your book where you describe the right, and I could be wrong about this, and if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me, is it seemed like you felt like most of the conspiracy theories, most of the things that were completely crazy were coming from that side of the spectrum, and they were very popular within that side of the spectrum, and the left wasn't quite pushing the same level of craziness. Is that...
Do I talk about conspiracy? I might talk about climate change a bit and anti-vaccination in the context of
things that sound like at least what mainstream media would call conspiracy theories, let's say.
Yeah, well, let me correct that. I don't think conspiracy theories are unique to the right. I think there are plenty of left-wing ones. And in fact, there are some outlets that specialize in exposing conspiracy theories that I subscribe to, like Skeptical Inquirer, which is an arm of the sort of free thought movement, which it seems to me increasingly never mention conspiracy theories on the left. Now, any conspiracy theory might be true, but a lot of people instinctively believe that the Russians were responsible for the Brexit vote.
Yes.
Now, maybe they were, but it's a conspiracy theory. I mean, there could be reason for it. I mean, it's plausible that it's the kind of thing the Russians might want to do. They might have good reason for that, but that's not to say there's evidence for it. It's plausible that Russians backed Donald Trump. They would have a good reason to want a weak American leader they could manipulate. But, that's not the same thing as there being evidence. So I want to, if I get that impression, I want to correct it. I mean, sometimes when writing the book, I felt I was instinctively a little bit right of centre. I wanted to correct the impression. Maybe I overcorrected it because, yes, I think there are conspiracy theories on the left. There's science denial on the left. That's a very long story, but that certainly exists. I talk a bit about that in the chapter on feminism. It's around. It takes different forms. It's about different things. It's probably more prevalent on the right. But I think conspiracy theories, science denial, it certainly exists on the left, and it's to worry about.
Do you think that there's a kind of overlap between left-wing positions, left-wing media, and just mainstream, completely media that sees itself as apolitical?
Right. So the left has gone mainstream in certain ways.
Yes.
It depends where you look. I think the media now is not what it was when I was growing up. I mean, when I was growing up, there were literally 3 TV channels. That's all, and local variations. Now, of course, we've got YouTube, we've got all these Netflix, we've got all these, any number of news sites and so on. And so you get the consequent polarization. I think there are sections of the media. I mean, my favorite examples are BBC Woman's Hour, at least until recently, and Channel 4 News, that always present themselves as very neutral, but certain left-wing assumptions are always being smuggled in. And so, almost unconsciously. I mean, as if the people doing this were not aware that these are assumptions that could be questioned. I mean, Woman's Hour, I think, in the, it's a bit different now, but under the regime of Jenny Murray and Jane Garvey, they were always pushing horror stories of unequal outcomes between men and women, and never really taking seriously the question that there could be a debate about what causes those unequal outcomes. Mm-hmm. That's not to justify any sort of discrimination, but the question wasn't raised. And similarly on Channel 4 with Black Lives Matter, I just noticed they devoted a whole week of the Channel 4 News to interviews with proponents of it, with very few critical questions. Now, I don't mean there should have been hostile questions, but there were certainly questions to be asked about what the movement stood for that I thought at the time weren't being asked. So, yes, I think within those areas of the media, I think you are right. But you find the same thing probably in more right-wing sources as well. Mm-hmm. I suspect it depends where you look.
Would you say that the mainstream media is not socialist, but fairly extremist in terms of the way that it takes on and enables and promotes left-wing social views?
I don't know. I mean, I think it certainly allows those views to be presented. Maybe it doesn't challenge them enough. I mean, they are regulated and they are supposed to, represent all views. Maybe I've been so indoctrinated by it, I don't notice it. I mean, I think there's a certain sort of social liberalism, which is now mostly a default position when it comes to large sections of the media, probably including the BBC. Whether that's good or not is another question, but there probably are. I honestly don't know. I mean, I think increasingly you do find views on the right being given a fair hearing. I wouldn't want to deny that. Mm-hmm. I'd have to think more carefully about it. I need more examples and a bigger picture.
Okay, well, I don't know if you feel this way, but my sense is that social liberalism that you just described is not the social liberalism of even 2009. It's a very new set of views. And it's a set of views that for most of my life I knew about and thought about and always thought of them as quite extreme. And now suddenly they're mainstream. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, up to a point, yes. I mean, if you take something like gay marriage, that sort of thing was proposed by the hated Ken Livingstone of the Greater London Council 40 years ago. He was regarded then as the loony left. Many of his ideas are now being mainstream. It was a Tory government that proposed gay marriage. That's become entirely mainstream and bourgeois. Similarly, perhaps with aspects of feminism, I don't know. You're right that the window, the range of acceptable views has moved socially leftwards over the last 40, 50 years. I think that's right. And oddly enough, in many ways, it's become less tolerant. So more social liberal and in certain areas less tolerant too. The old-fashioned Orwellian ideal of free speech, he's writing in the war, has more or less gone. There are many people on the left who are very suspicious of the idea of free speech because they think it attracts, they think it's intrinsically hostile to social liberal views, which of course it isn't. But people suspect it is, that these free speech people are people who want to impose conservative values on, which is very odd. And as you pointed out earlier on, it's a weird thing and certainly not conceptually true.
Do you think, and this is kind of bringing back to your, this goes back to some of your ideas about the post-truth society. Do you think that there's something valuable about a post-truth society as long as it's stated carefully? Something possibly like this, which is, in order to have a society that changes without there being imposition of one view on another or the restriction of free inquiry or freedom of speech, we all have to be a little bit skeptical about whatever it is we believe.
Yeah. Well, I make this point myself, but I distinguish skepticism from relativism. Right. And so I believe in a skeptical attitude, and I believe, as far as possible, in scrutinizing one's own views and prejudices as well. And I tried to do that while writing the book, hence it was quite difficult to write. But, it's one thing to say that given the influence of all sorts of irrational factors, epistemic vices like carelessness and dishonesty, and ideological motivations, it's highly likely that many of my beliefs are false. And it might take the generation below me to point that out when I get very old. But that's not the same thing as to lose faith in the existence of truth and the value of pursuing it. I think we should value truth. I think that truth is objective, or reality is objective in a way quite tautological way. There's just stuff out there and it's reality. It doesn't depend on our opinions, except in certain limited domains, perhaps like values could be, in some complex sense, subject-dependent, but not in the sense that most relatives are talking about. But there's truth, all right. It's hard to find, but we should try to find it. It's not, I don't want to advocate post-truth, but I do want to advocate skepticism about what people claim to be true, because often it's not. And it's that that's exploited, of course, by conspiracy theorists, because they can say, how do you know it's true? It's just because everyone says this. Everyone talks about climate change, but that doesn't make it true. So you can sort of latch on to the motive, the legitimate motive of skepticism to suck people into a sort of post-truth world.
Do you think that there are ever conflicts between what is true and what society needs to believe to be able to accept the truth peacefully over time?
I'm sure there are. Do you have examples?
Okay. It might be true, for instance, that people of color are systemically discriminated against. Someone saying the systemic discrimination is actually false could exacerbate that discrimination, and that's an objective harm. But we have to allow people to say the thing that causes the harm, because allowing both sides to say what they think is the best recipe for any change to happen without violence. I
think on the whole, I would go with that, yes. But your earlier question was whether certain falsehoods that it's good for society to hold, or was that...
No, is there ever a conflict between certain truths and what society needs to believe in order to be able to change without violence?
And so the conflict between truths like what?
Okay, the example that came afterwards would be, okay, suppose it genuinely is true that people of color are systemically discriminated against. Yeah. That discrimination is intensified by people denying it. That's all true.
Yeah.
But there is a greater good, which is if you allow the people to cause that harm by denying the discrimination, you're allowing everyone to say what they think, and that greater good allows for society to change without violence. Whereas if you say, no, only the person speaking the truth should be allowed to say this, the one who isn't doing the harm, you create conditions under which actually, because people are silenced, there's more likely to be social change that arises through conflict and violence.
This touched a bit on what we were saying at the beginning of this interview about the things like the Yale Halloween stuff and everything. I think on the whole, it's much better if people both felt and were able to say what they thought and were actually able to. And I think that sometimes good social change does come from people saying what they think and being exposed as ignorant or poor reasoners. That's the ideal way you do this. But there might be other times when you really couldn't affect change. I'm still not sure I've got a complete handle on your question, but I think I see where you're roughly going with this. And I think, I still go for the traditionally liberal solution to those sort of problems. Mm-hmm. Let people speak their minds, defeat them with argument, if at all possible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the liberal solution that you're advocating, but one of the things that I wonder about it is it ultimately justified? Because if we're too certain about what we think is true, even if we're right, we cause violence and destruction.
By being too certain or by seeking to impose?
Well, when we're too certain, we put our truths into practice naturally. So if we're very certain that, people of color are being discriminated against, we inevitably want to end the discrimination, and we want to assert that the discrimination is real and that's true and everything else is false insofar as it contradicts that. But if we're too certain, rather than allow society to get rid of the discrimination organically through the changing of hearts and minds, through debate, we go into violent mode.
Yeah, well, if there is a connection, it's a causal connection, not a conceptual one. I mean, it's perfectly possible to be absolutely certain of your views and yet not want to impose them, want them to see justified in the realm of open inquiry and debate. That may not be an effective way of reaching the truth, but you should hope that it is, because I think that violence is something we should want to avoid at almost all costs. Obviously, we can't always avoid it, but we should have a default position where we avoid violence and this sort of divisive polarization. I mean, one can be certain. I think one can. I mean, psychologically, you find that people with great certainties find it relatively easy to impose their views on other people because they think they've got morality and virtue behind them. Mm-hmm. That's a psychological trait, I think. The two things go together. That's why people who are with very, very strong beliefs are sometimes to be seen with suspicion. But equally, there can be people with very strong beliefs who don't want to impose them, who are convinced, like my authoritarian example in the first chapter, maybe Mill's example of the Catholic Church in the 19th century, said, we have the truth without a doubt. But the great thing is we've got reason behind us too. If we didn't believe reason was behind us, we wouldn't think what we were saying was true. So, of course, we want to spread reason. And if we encourage people to see the reasons we have for our beliefs, we might need a bit of censorship, so people shouldn't read too much of the opposing reasons because they might be misled. But if we sincerely believe that what we believe is true and is therefore rationally justifiable in the end, we should welcome dialogue. Mm-hmm. That would be the ideal position. Of course, the counter-argument, which I've been wrestling with throughout the book, is that reason doesn't always win out. Truth does not always emerge in the marketplace of ideas. And incidentally, Mill didn't think it did either. He has a very complex argument about that. Mm-hmm. So you might have to impose what we do sincerely consider to be truth and rational for some immediate good. The problem with that is that in a pluralistic society where different values flourish, everybody claiming the right to impose their version of the truth on others. And you need some proper system of arbitration whereby we can fairly agree who has a right to try to impose their version of the truth, who doesn't, and under what circumstances. And I think in the end, honest, open, robust debate is the best way to that end, I think.
Do you think one of the big obstacles towards that honest, robust debate is, for whatever reason, in the last 10 years, there's been a very popular attitude amongst people very passionate about politics, wherever they are on the political spectrum, and that is, if I'm right in pointing out some sort of injustice or restriction of freedom, I don't have to play by the same rules as the person who's wrong.
Yeah, I'm sure you do find that on all sides, and it's pretty alarming what moral conviction can do to people's moral character. If I'm right, and if I actually notice some severe, important injustice, I can silence people, I can coerce people to accepting my views, I can subvert institutions. Yeah, and I think what you're really talking about is fanaticism. Now, fanaticism is a complex concept because clearly nobody's going to object to people believing what's true and believing it with fervour and wanting to bring about what they believe in the world. The objection is the fanatics' inability to see that, first of all, their certainty is probably unjustified. More important, that other human values, apart from imposing your personal truth, are important too, like toleration, like allowing discussion with people who disagree, like compromise. I was at a very interesting Zoom lecture about 3-4 weeks ago with the philosopher Kasim Kassam, who has an interesting analysis of extremism, which I think is worth looking at. There's something. It's not being extreme. It's not a matter of what you think per se. It's a matter of having a certain sort of mindset. And he delineated all sorts of themes of that mindset, including closed-mindedness, willingness to impose, lack of toleration, and other things too. And I think you're right. In our culture, we've seen the emergence of that. It's sometimes also, as you suggested yourself earlier on, it can pose as very mainstream and neutral. When it does that, it's often because we've forgotten its radical roots and we've just normalized it in our minds. But equally, it might be correct in unearthing our own prejudices. And that's why there's no alternative really to careful thought and self-interrogation.
Here's an interesting question about fanaticism. Okay, I'm curious how you would answer this. I'm in favor of universal basic income. You might not be, and that's fine. But I'm in favor of universal basic income. I also really dislike fanaticism. If I notice a very effective universal basic income movement that at least has its biggest stars being fanatics and doing fanatical things to implement universal basic income, if I support universal basic income but I don't like fanatics, should I support that movement?
The movement is fanatical in enacting?
Yes.
Well, I suspect, no, I don't see why you should. I mean, you might have certain, you might go into temporary alliances for a while in order to bring about certain goods. But I mean, the history of these movements often is that once they gain power and once they achieve their objectives, they overreach themselves. They become tyrannical. I mean, this is the history of revolutions, since the beginning of modernity. So, I mean, I think I would stick by your suspicion of fanaticism.
So does that imply that you think that the way in which social change happens is more important than the justice of social change?
I think they're both important. I think if one is prepared to adopt any method that might be effective to enact social change, that casts doubt upon your moral integrity, I think. I mean, for example, I'm not a consequentialist. I'm not somebody who thinks that, the ends always justify the means. That's a crude account of it. But, you get this strand of thinking that, it's a price worth paying, curtailing people's liberty, imprisoning a few people who are falsely accused of certain crimes, this sort of thing. I don't go along with that. I think I'm a pluralist. I think there are many values that are important, and there's no overarching principle for resolving them. I think one important value is toleration and receptivity and willingness to listen. There are times, perhaps regrettably, when that might be overridable by some really important social goal. But there's always a great danger once the goal's been achieved that you forget that the intolerance was only temporary to achieve the goal, and it becomes a permanent feature of you. And that, I think, is the history of radical changes, much a part of the history of radical changes for a long time.
Okay, suppose you were living in Weimar, Germany in 1932. Suppose you knew you could predict in 1932 one of two things would happen. Either Hitler comes to power, or there's a liberal democratic party that will come to power, which has most of the views you agree with, including toleration. It just happens that most of the people fighting for that liberal democratic movement are fanatics. Do you side with them to avoid the Third Reich?
Well, are they fanatics if they do propound liberal toleration? Or would that be, have you described a contradiction there?
There is a bit of a psychological contradiction in that they act like fanatics, even though their views seem to be ones that embrace toleration.
So they're fanatically pro-toleration?
Yes.
All right, so how would the fanaticism manifest itself?
Well, they might be so pro-toleration that they tolerate things like parents having sex with their children.
Okay, so in certain areas they're tolerant, and maybe not others.
Yeah.
Well, here we're trying to weigh up harms, I suppose. I mean, the evil of Hitler is a very great harm, and if he really was the only way to stop Hitler coming to power is by at least temporarily tolerating people who want deadly incest with children, well, you keep an eye on that, but I suppose in the circumstances, I'm just talking off the top of my head here, you might opt for the route that would not allow Hitler. Always mindful that, you better keep a watch out on your own side as well. I mean, I thought you were going to ask me, actually, the question of whether I'd approve the assassination of Hitler if I knew where he was going to go.
Oh, well, that's an easier one, but you can answer that too if you want.
I honestly don't know. I mean, my moral instincts are quite unformed. There's a lot of, and I don't really have a moral tradition I can pin myself to. There are going to be deontologists who will think that there are certain acts that are always wrong, like assassinating tyrants. And I'm pretty sympathetic to deontology, which is one reason I'm not sympathetic to a lot of the stuff I'm talking about in the book, the sort of mass movements based on identity politics that seem to override those constraints. But I suspect the only way you can make ultimate sense of an absolute prohibition on assassination and other forms of killing would be within a religious worldview. There's a God who's created us, and our lives are sacred for that reason. Since I'm pretty agnostic about that worldview, I can't be certain of the deontological view that I'd like to believe. So I'm just, at these moments, I sense the strength of the prayer, there but for the grace of God go I, which I think is something we should all bear in mind, because we honestly don't know what we would do in certain extreme situations.
I suppose for me, with the Hitler question, would you kill Hitler? I don't find that interesting philosophically, to be honest, because it seems to me that killing Hitler would be largely ineffective at bringing about the destruction of the Third Reich and fascism.
Yeah. There'd be someone else, yeah. Yeah, you might be probably right. This is not what you find when discussing these dilemmas. I mean, as you know, there's a famous dilemma that Bernard Williams talks about in his critique of utilitarianism, the Indians case, Jim and the Indians. He's offered the chance, you kill one Indian yourself or I'll kill all 20. Now, you might think it's just obvious what you should do, save lives. But in practice, you might not, because, where's it going to end? He's going to say, oh, actually, I wanted to kill this another one, and now another one. So there are pretty good consequentialist reasons for not going down what looks like the consequentialist route. And that's a comfort to me, I think.
Well, there's a really interesting extreme version of that Williams case. I don't know if you've heard of this, but in this extreme version, there's a demon that lives in another galaxy. And the demon is going to kill a much larger version of Earth with Earth-like creatures who are much more benevolent than we are and much more sensitive than we are. Kill them all by burning them over a long period of time in which they will have a slow, agonizing death. And this Earth-like planet exists in a galaxy far, far away from here that we will never come in contact with ever. So if all of this happens, we'll never know it. But you can stop this from happening. All you have to do is go in a room for the rest of your life and sadistically torture your family. And every time they die, there'll be medics who bring them back to life so you can torture them again. And all you do for the rest of your life is torture them. And then you save this planet of lovely beings from having an agonizing death who you will never, ever come in contact with. Is it the moral thing to do to torture your family to save the planet?
Well, instinctively, my answer is no, because I think there are certain special relations that should always be preserved. But, I mean, what this brings to mind is that very often, I taught medical ethics for 7 years at Imperial College, and we came up with these sort of killing dilemmas a lot. And what you learn often is that sometimes there's simply no right answer, no one right answer to a question like that. And I think there are dilemmas sometimes. Fanatics don't see dilemmas, or they resolve them the wrong way, but sometimes there are dilemmas. Sometimes I suspect there are situations when it is actually impossible to do the right thing or to do things that don't involve a moral stain. Or if there aren't dilemmas, there are moral remainders sometimes, whereby there might be a right thing to do, but what you do, each of the options leaves you with a moral stain, even though one's better than the other in some sense.
So would you say that the torturing your family decision is got such a huge moral stain attached to it for you that it's worth letting even a planet perish?
Because you'd have to know this is actually true. I mean, in practice, you have to know all sorts of things about the situation. Are you not being deceived? Would somebody wicked enough to, present that option be trusted to, not to carry out his threat? In practice, of course, you wouldn't trust a person who made a threat like that.
Yeah.
So these are highly hypothetical situations. I mean, it's a bit like the old debate about nuclear warfare. I remember in an old book, Jonathan Glover Causing Death and Saving Lives, talks about the ethics of nuclear war, saying, well, we can be contingent pacifists about certain things. We can think of scenarios when dropping nuclear weapons on civilians might be the right thing to do, but they're extremely unlikely to arise. So we can be pacifists about it, or at least with respect to that question, without having to say that it could never be right to do those things. That, of course, that doesn't answer your question, but I don't want to answer it. I don't know what I'd really do or say.
Well, my suspicion is, and you might disagree with me, and it's totally fine if you do, but my suspicion is the answer to the question is that is the arena where morality stops being useful to humans.
Yes, because morality arises from actual human concerns that we have. They arise from our relationships. And we have moral concepts based on relationship, for example, like love in particular, which isn't much talked about in moral philosophy.
Yes.
Friendship. I mean, there needs to be more, in bioethics particularly, it needs to be a concept. And possibly you can't accommodate these concepts within standard moral theory. I have a suspicion that the way moral philosophy is often conducted, at least in the mainstream, there's little room for.
Yeah, there's an interesting idea that all the kind of branches of ethics are really ways of helping you have a better social identity. So the Kantian elements of morality make you trustworthy. The utilitarian elements of morality make you help most people if you have to make decisions. And the kind of Aristotelian elements make you a good citizen.
Yeah, and you need all three in different contexts.
But there's also areas where they don't do those things, and when they don't do those things, you dispense with morality because it's not useful to us anymore.
Or you dispense with one part of morality in favour of another part, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be true that certain professions or roles are particularly suited to Kantian ethics, maybe in the military, for example, I don't know, obeying. Others are more suited to Aristotelian or virtue ethics generally, maybe being an educator, instructor, or parents, and others are more suited to consequentialist ways of thinking, like being a government house civil servant or something. There are certain areas where the one way of thinking will predominate, but that's different than saying that any one way of thinking should be seen as totalizing.
Yeah. So going back to your book, would you say that your defense of free inquiry, is that presupposing a Kantian or utilitarian or virtue framework, or is it freestanding, you think?
Well, I don't really have a moral view. I don't define myself as a Kantian or Aristotelian. I suppose if I had to choose, I think that something like virtue ethics based on a loose enough notion of human nature is in the right. It's got the right idea when it comes to ethics. But I've got deontological elements too. I've never been particularly sympathetic to consequentialism, so I think my defense of free inquiry is one which I think is freestanding. I mean, I don't want to say that the justification for it is just consequentialist. For one thing, it's hostage to fortune because it might not work out that way, and it's a wrong justification anyway. I want to say I think that we owe the respect to ourselves as free, autonomous, or potentially autonomous human beings to let our reason go where it would lead us. Obviously, always listening to what other people say too, and preparing to accept they're wrong, because I think that. Additional point, we flourish best in an atmosphere of liberality, an atmosphere of freedom. Not always, not in all contexts, but in the context that concerned me when writing the book, which is focused partly on campus controversies and other things, there's something stifling and contrary to flourishing about having to censor yourself all the time, or having to think you might have thought the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that informal self-censorship is just as damaging as official censorship in the form of the law?
It can be, yes, it can be, because people actually then persuade themselves that they think something other than what they would think if they did not self themselves and thereby did not subject themselves to irrational pressures. I think that self-censorship, you find it's a great temptation. I find it in myself, if I find that most of my peers think something entirely different to what I think, I will wonder whether I was wrong, whether I just had missed something. And I'll be more cautious about saying those things publicly sometimes. I mean, even writing the book, I noticed this a bit. But I think, going back to the point about Emmanuel Goldstein in Orwell and Crime Stop, we can all develop this faculty of knowing somehow where a thought is going and stopping at the threshold. But you get very tied up mentally. It's exhausting and probably a cause of a great deal of neurosis if you have to be doing this a great deal. So I'd rather we did less of it and just admitted what we thought and where the arguments went, and were prepared to discuss these things with others.
Yes. And those of you listening, as you can tell, you have good reasons to pick up Intellectual Freedom in the Culture Wars by Piers Benn. Thank you so much for part one of this discussion.
I've been a bit vague in some of my answers, but they're very difficult questions, so thanks for posing them anyway.
Was that fun for you? It was fun for me.
We're off air now, as it were. Yeah, well, not entirely. Yes, it was in parts. I mean, some of your questions were quite difficult. I know I waffled a bit and didn't always feel focused on certain answers, but never mind.
Well, nobody could tell. Trust me.
I'm sure you could, yeah. No, you could. It's difficult, some of that stuff, and I don't always phrase my points very well. But yeah, you asked good questions.
No, you are. I mean, I don't. You know this probably, but you're extraordinarily articulate.
Am I? Oh well.
Yes.
I thought I was mangle my sentences all the time. I talk very fast, I know that, and I qualify. I do too many subordinate clauses. There's too much going on in my mind, you know.
Yeah, but that means you think really deeply, and that sounds really impressive.
Oh, well, let them have gone over. Well, anyway, I hope I haven't set myself up for execution by some things I said about trans people or whatever. I mean...
I don't think so. I mean, here's the thing with that whole debate. If you say anything at all other than yes, you've set yourself up for execution.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There are... In general, what question to... Yes, you put quite nicely the view that... there is transphobia because the view itself, that not acknowledging people's sense of identity, is itself hateful. And I want to say, well, no, it isn't, because transphobia is actually how you behave towards people, and you might, etc., etc. But yeah, I mean, it's you put the counter argument very nicely.
This is Greg Scorzo, and that was the Culture and the Offensive podcast. If you like this podcast, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're interested in any of the other things that we do at Coda Publishing, check out www.cultureandtheoffensive.com. At Culture and the Offensive, you can purchase my new book, Post-Socratic Dialogues Love, available from amazon.co.uk and amazon.com. You can also hear 3 chapters of that book for free in my play Love Before COVID, which we will post a link to below. So stay safe, be courageous, and don't forget to go outside of your comfort zone. And remember, when you hear things that sound wrong or stupid or silly or strange, don't forget to use empathy, clarity, and courage.